Section 1 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 1. George Washington, 1789 to 1797. In Virginia, near the banks of the stream we call the Potomac, there is a spot known as Bridges Creek. It is so small a place that you cannot call it a town, yet it is dear to the hearts of Americans. For here, on the 22nd of February, 1732, George Washington was born. A few fig trees are still seen, and here and there a wild rose peeps out of the weeds to show you that once on a time a home was there. A few loose bricks and bits of lime still lie on the ground where the old farmhouse once stood. In 1815, a small stone slab was put there to mark the spot. The coat of arms of the Washingtons was a white shield with 2 red bars on it, and on top were 3 stars, so that the whole was like the Stars and Stripes in a way. When George was 3 years old, the Washingtons left this home and went to live in a low red house on a hill near Fredericksburg. The tale of the way in which George cut the fruit trees has been told all through the years to the small folks of this land, to show his love of truth. He had been brought up to tell the truth, and to do what was right at all times. One who was near kin to him tells the tale. One fine day, she said, when George was 5 years old, his pa took us both by the hand and bade us come with him to look at the fruit trees. The whole earth was strewn with the fruit, but there was one tree that had not borne in the past, and was a choice kind. This was found to be cut. George hung back. "Who has done this?" said Mr. Washington in a rage, for the bark of the tree had been cut in such a way that one could not hope for fruit for years. The small boy came forth in a brave way. "I did it, Pa. I cannot tell a lie. I cut it," he said. Mr. Washington was so struck by this show of truth on the part of his son that his rage left him, and he felt more proud than he had been of his boy. George, from the time he was quite a small lad, kept a book in which he wrote down all the things that took place in his life. When George was scarce a man in years, he took charge of some troops sent out to save his state from the bands of fierce Indians and the hosts of French who sought to steal more land. 1/4 of all the state troops were put in his charge, and for his work in this line he got a small pay that in our day would scarce be thought what a strong man could live on. He did a good deal of hard work to train his men in the right way for the fight. He had just got his men so that they could well cope with the foe, when word came from the head of the state that bade him start on a new task. It had been heard that the French and Indians had gone to work to build forts in a long line on the Ohio. To find out if this was so, Washington was sent to the front with a note to the chief man of the French troops. Though it was cold and bleak, young Washington did not shrink at the task set for him. He well knew at the time that most of his way would lead through dark woods by bad roads for miles and miles, but he did not flinch. Washington had 4 men with him when he made the start, a guide to show him the way, and one who knew how to speak French, with 2 men to guard the goods, and to do all the odd kinds of work there might be on hand. A hard time they had of it at first, as their way led through swamp and mire. At last they found the fort of which they were in search. Here Washington had a long talk with the chief of the French troops, who was a man who had been long in wars. Though kind, he was very firm when his rights were at stake. George did not gain much by this trip, as he was told that the French had all the land round neath their thumbs. They had sent out word to seize all men found at large who did not prove they were friends. When Washington got the note he was to take back, he made his way, with his men, home once more. It was more cold than when they had made their start, for the snow and ice lay thick on field and stream, and it was hard to get through it all. At one time they had to ford a stream by means of a raft, and Washington made a slip from the damp logs. If he had not been caught by one of his men, he might have lost his life. The way in which Washington had done his task won him much praise, and the head of his state went so far as to make a note of his act to the King of England. He was at once made a colonel, and 2 bands of troops were put in his charge to stop the French who sought to seize more land. As George Washington had no gold with him to pay his men, and as the state did not try to help him, it was not strange that in his first fight he did not win the day, though he strove hard and well to turn the tide. The head of the French troops praised George and his men for the brave ways in which they had fought, and his own state at once sent him some gold to pay his troops. It was not long from this time that George took charge of a part of the troops of General Braddock. This was thought at the time to be quite a high post, so you may be sure he was not long in doubt if he should take it. It was in the month of June, 1755, that the troops made their way to Fort Duquesne, where they were to stay. They had scarce been on the road a day ere Washington fell sick, but he kept up like a brave man, and in spite of his friends would march at the head of his men. Washington knew so well the tricks of the shrewd foe they had to deal with, that he wished Braddock to let him take the lead with those men who knew the Indians' ways best, but he would not. Braddock had cause soon to know his course had been wrong, for the woods were thick with Indians who rent the air with their shrieks and war-whoops. From rocks and trees they sprang on the troops like wild beasts. Washington had his horse shot, and Braddock got such a wound that there was no hope for his life. They had to flee from the foe, and he died on the way. His last words to Washington, "Oh, if I had but done as you said, all might have been well, or at least our loss would not have been so great." He left Washington a horse that had been with him through the wars, and an old slave whom he had brought up to serve him. When the news of this fight was brought to Governor Dinwiddie, there was great fear of the Indians now that they had shown how strong they were. They knew, too, that if it had not been for Washington, their hopes would all be lost. Braddock lost the fight, they said, but Washington was the one who saved the troops. When the heads of the state met, they made a vote to give Washington a large sum to pay, if they could, all he had done for them, and they made him the chief of all the troops in the colonies. His first step was to place his men so that they could stop the Indians when they tried to rob and burn the homes of the land. He did this so well that he got much praise for his work. To aid him in this task, he made all his men dress in the same garb as the Indians. This was a great help to them, as it was light and cheap. On the 17th of January, 1759, Washington was wed to Mrs. Martha Custis, who was as good as she was fair. He spent 3 months with his wife at their home, which was known as the White House in New Kent, and at the close of that year they kept house at Mount Vernon, his old place. While here, Washington gave much time to the care of his farm, but he still held in view the state of things in our land, and did not lose sight of the great moves of the day in the cares of home life. At this time men felt that the rule of England was a hard yoke to bear, as the tax on goods made here was quite high. Lord North sought to make this tax more than it had been, with not so much as a word to our folk till it was done. It was not strange, then, that all who were free-born should feel that this was a great wrong that was thrust on them, and that they would not stand it. They did not mind as long as England was just in her rule, but they did not like to have the king treat them as slaves. So they got into a rage with the sense of their wrongs, and said they would have their rights, which was but just. They tore down the homes of those in their midst who were on the side of the British, and sought to kill those who would force on them the Stamp Act, the tax they had cause to hate. The mob was full of rage, and there was great fear that a war would take place if England did not at once put a stop to the Stamp Act. They still kept up the tax of 3d. a pound on tea, and sent 3 ships here full, but our men one night broke the chests, and threw it all in the sea. From that time signs of war were seen, and the first fight took place at Lexington on the Lord's Day between British and American troops, and then the cry went out through the length and breadth of our land, "To arms! To arms!" In view of this fear of a great war that might soon come, men met at Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775, and Washington was made chief of all our troops. He took full charge of them in the latter part of June in the same year near Boston. The British had thrown up earthworks on the hills on all sides, so that help would be cut off from the town, and the plight of those who had to bear the siege was in truth a sad one. As soon as Washington could train his raw troops, he made out to get rid of the foe, and one morn the British got quite a shock when they saw that a new line of earthworks had been thrown up by him and his men in the night, and that he was in the best place too. This they saw with fear, and sent troops by night to drive off our men, but a storm was in their way, so they could not do much harm. When the British saw that they could not force our men to go, they thought it best to leave Boston with their ships, which was done. When our troops went in the town, they found its streets strewn with things the British had left in their haste. All the great guns had spikes in them, so that they were of no use, but Washington was glad to think he had won the day, and much praise was his for the part he had in the work. He had a fear that the British troops might be on their way to New York, so he sent part of his men to aid those there in case they should have to fight for their homes. But instead of that, the British ships made sail for Halifax, from whence their troops took all the line of forts in Canada, and made the land theirs. It was at this time that Richard Henry Lee of Virginia made a move in Congress that our land should rise up and say it would be free from British rule, and for this was drawn up the Declaration of Independence, and the chief men of the day put their names to it, and Congress, on the 4th of July, 1776, put it in force. When Washington got this, he read it in a loud voice to all his troops, and its strong words did much to raise their hopes. For some time they had feared that they could not stand or gain their rights with such a foe as England, but they took heart from this time. Lord Howe, the English governor, tried to get Washington to draw off his men, and sent to him word that if he would stop the war, the king would not be hard on him for the part he took in it. But Washington said, "No, I fight for a just cause, and I will not give it up." The British then went in for war, and had all their troops land at Long Island. They had 3 times more men than Washington, and a host of large guns, while he had few. Washington stood on a hill near by, and through his field glass saw them land. He felt great fear in his heart as he made account of the hordes of the foe. He cried out, as he thought of his own troops, "My God, what brave men must I this day lose!" From that time it would seem that all went wrong for him. Our ranks were mown down, and great loss of life took place as they sought to flee from the foe. It was not long from this time that the dread news came to Washington that General Lee, who had been sent with a body of troops to guard Philadelphia, was in the hands of the foe. This was the dark hour of the fight, and Washington's brave heart was sick with fear. He still tried to show a brave front, and did not let his men know how sad was his heart. The British now took up their stand at Trenton, and Washington, who by this time had got more troops to his aid, thought he would cross the Delaware, though it was full of ice, and come on them, when they did not know it. At 4, on the dawn of Christmas Day, he and his troops made their way through the ice in the stream in boats. The cold was great, and the men in their poor clothes felt it a great deal, but still they would not back out, and kept on their way with brave hearts. That day our troops put the foe to rout, and took a great deal of spoils in the way of arms and large guns, for which they stood in great need. Great was the joy through the land when this news was known. When the new year came, fresh hope sprang up in all hearts, for Washington won the fights at Bennington, Stillwater, and Saratoga, and in October of 1777 all the British troops in charge of General Burgoyne gave up their arms to General Gates. He let them go home when he had their pledge that they would not take up arms in our war in the years to come. That year, when the cold set in, Washington made a camp with his men in Valley Forge, and a hard time they had of it there. Food was scarce, and not a man in all his ranks had a good pair of shoes on his feet or a whole suit of clothes to his back. Some had no shoes at all, and when they went round their feet left stains of blood on the snow. Yet they all kept their hopes up and still had faith in Washington. In the spring the camp in this drear place broke up, and all were glad to leave it. Our troops met the foe once more at Monmouth Courthouse, and through the fault of General Lee, who had not done as Washington bade him, we lost the battle. In this fight the Marquis de Lafayette, a young man from France who had come to our land to fight for our cause, which he knew to be just, got much praise for the brave stand he made. In the spring of 1779, Sir Henry Clinton, now the head of the British troops, tried to get in his hands the posts and forts on the line of the Hudson. He made out to take 2 when Washington came up in time to cut him off from the rest. One of these forts, which was known as Stony Point, was won at the end of a long fight. Stores that were worth a small mint of gold fell into our hands. Benedict Arnold had been put in charge of the fort at West Point and some posts on the line that the British wished to get. He made up his mind to give them up to the foe at a price. With this thought in view, he soon made a deal with the chief of the foe to give up the posts and forts for a large sum of gold. The note to Clinton, in which he made his wish known, was sent by a young spy, Major Andre, of the British troops. On the way back to his fort, Andre met 3 men in the dress of our troops and was made to halt. They found the lines from Arnold in his boots and brought him to the camp of our troops. He was tried and hung as a spy. Washington felt sad that he must cut this young man off in the prime of his life, yet he knew he must do it or our ranks would soon be run down by such men. But Benedict Arnold had by this time made his way in great haste to a ship and set sail for England, for he was in fear of his life. His name is one that all hear with scorn, as a wretch who would have sold his land into the hands of the foe. The land to which he fled gave him a home, but no friends. Let us not speak of him in the same breath as those brave men who fought and bled that we might live in the land of the free. With the help of the troops of brave French who had been sent to us through Lafayette, October 19th, 1781, the British troops in charge of Cornwallis gave up their arms to Washington at Yorktown. This was a great stroke of luck that no one could have thought would take place. It was not long from this time that news was brought to Washington that it was the wish of our folk that he should take on him the name and crown of a king. This might well tempt one fond of pomp and state, but Washington was not that kind of a man. He spoke his mind with such strong words that they did not press a crown on him. In March of 1783 came the news of peace through the land, which Washington read with joy to his troops. Yet he shed tears at the thought that they must soon leave him. Not long from that time, Washington gave up the charge of his troops and said good-bye to those who were his aides in the war. I may not come to each of you and take my leave, he said with tears in his eyes, but I shall be glad if you each will come to me and let me grasp you by the hand. Washington now had a wish to go back to his home at Mount Vernon, where he could rest from the toils and cares of war. He knew that there was no fear of the British, and that our land, for the time at least, was in peace. At Mount Vernon he gave his time up, for the most part, to take care of his farm. He rose at the break of day, as a rule, and rode through the fields. He wrote a great deal each day to his friends, and did much hard work on his place, which he did not find was in so good a state since the war. When our men met in Philadelphia in May 1787 to fix the laws of the land, Washington met with them, and the laws then fixed on and put in force are much the same as those we use today. Then Washington was at once thought of as the right man for president. You know the way we choose a president in this land is by votes. All men do not think the same way or hold the same views, so there have been at all times 2 or more bands of men who choose whom they would have for president and vice president. The side that gets the most votes wins the day, of course. In our day, these 2 bands of men are known as Democrats and Republicans. In years past, the last were known by the name of Whigs at one time. Washington did not wish, at his age, near 80, to take a place of such great care and trust, but he was led to do so at last. On his way to take this high place, he was hailed with joy by all. The bells rang out glad peals from the church spires of the towns through which he passed, and young girls clad in white strewed his path with sweet buds and bloom, and wreaths were hung, and flags flung out to the breeze, and the cries of crowds rent the air, while President Washington lived in a plain way, for pomp and show were not to his taste. He was prompt in his ways, and did all things by rule. He was kind to those who served him, but strict, and would not let them slight their work. When one of his clerks who came late each day gave as a cause more than once that his watch was slow, he said to him, "Well, you must get a new watch, or I will get a new clerk." The Indians once more stirred up war, and Washington sent out a small force to bring them to terms. He served 2 terms, but would not take a third. Washington spent the last years of his life in peace at home. America could ask no more from his hands. His work was done. His arm had been the one to save her in the dark hours that came ere the dawn that made us free, and now he must have rest. On the 12th day of December 1799, he went out to take a ride. At noon the snow fell and the rain, but he went his rounds just the same in spite of it. He had felt ere he went on this ride that his throat was sore, and had no doubt he caught more cold as he made his rounds through the storm. He had to take to his bed, and it was with great pain that he could breathe. All known cures were tried, but in vain. The end was near. At 10 in the night they gave up all hope, and his wife was brought to the couch where the brave man lay in pain. He tried to speak once or twice, but did not have strength. At length he said, in a low voice that was full of hope for the life to come, "'Tis well, 'tis well." These were his last words. What a wail went up from far and near when the sad news was known. More than one strong man cried like a child. The old world and the new heard of his death with grief. They felt that a great man was lost to the world when that brave heart had ceased to beat. His name is held dear to this day in the hearts of all who live in the land he loved. His birthday has been kept each year since he died, and throngs have gone to look at his tomb at Mount Vernon, and felt it to be a boon to stand by the spot where the great man lies. As we have said, Washington did not think it wise to serve for a third term. There is no doubt that this course led Jefferson and the rest who came after him to feel that it was best to walk in his steps and serve but for 8 years, so that now we have grown to look on 2 terms as all that a president should hope for at the hands of his friends. When General Grant, at the close of the war in which he had won so much fame, was placed at the head of the land, he served 2 terms. There was some talk of a third. His friends felt that they could not do too much to show their love and pride in the man who had led our troops so well and put an end to the sad war. But there was a cry raised by the press that though it was not down in the law of the land, yet it was a fixed fact that no one had ruled for more than 8 years, and no one should hope to do so. So the friends of Grant feared to bring his name out. Though they were in such force, they might have won the day. There were some well-known names kept back till it was seen that Grant would not be named. Garfield was one, and it was at last voted on and won the first place. End of section 1, read by Inkel. Section 2 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 2. John Adams, 1797 to 1801. John Adams, our next president, was born on a farm in Braintree, Massachusetts, near Boston, in 1735, and was the son of one who tilled the ground for his bread. The first thing John was taught was how to care for the fields and feed and take charge of the beasts on the farm. In the cold months of the year, he was sent to the old schoolhouse nearby to learn to read and write. From the start, he showed signs that there was in him what goes to make up a great man. He went through Harvard College and worked for what he lived on, as he read law for 2 years or more at a school near Worcester. The pay was poor and not what a young man could live on in our times, but he was glad to get it, as it helped him to reach his aim in life. It had been his first wish to learn how to preach the word of God, but he found he could not put his heart in the creed that was then in use. He went into the bar in 1758, but still lived at home on the farm at Braintree. He is said to have been a man of great mind and bright thoughts, to have had a clear voice, sweet and strong, and his speech was full of grace. He showed then that he was a man who could lead and rule, and his words were sure to move all who heard him speak. When the Stamp Act passed in 1764, he took his first real turn at the laws of the land, and when a mass of folks from his hometown met to talk of this act, he made a speech and sent to those at the head of his state his views on it. He first put his thoughts into print a year from that time, when he brought out a work on law that gained him much praise, if not gold. The same year the men in Boston bade him, with the help of 2 more friends, to get up a plea to the head of the state, in which they asked that the courts of the law, which had been closed, should be once more made free to all. In 3 years he moved from his old home to Boston, where he soon gained a large sum by his work in law, which grew each year that he was there. He was soon known as one of the most famed in law of his time, and his help was asked for when a grave case came up in the courts. When the British fired on the mob at Boston in 1770, he took his stand and put the case in a fair way that the folks in their blind rage could not judge with cool minds. From that time he was the one to whom all the heads of our land looked for aid in the dark days of the war. He showed them on all law points just what it was safe to do and how to put the law in force. Mr. Adams was one of the 5 men sent from his state to the first Congress. He plunged at once in the black stream of the Revolution. He had no fears for his own life, and was filled with a wish to aid his land in her hour of war. To his friend he said at the time, "The die is now cast. I have passed the point from which I may not turn back. Sink or swim, live or die, I cannot. It is still my wish to go straight on to the goal of my hopes." In Congress he held full sway, and at his rule no one dared to raise a voice. They knew too well the man with whom they had to deal, and that they were not so strong as he in mind and thought, so they gave way to him. It was not long ere he was raised to the head of the great band of great men, and we are told he proved just as wise and shrewd a man as his friends had hoped. He wrote much for the press in these 2 years. His works were for the most part on the rights of our land. He was the first man in Congress to ask that George Washington be placed at the head of our troops. He served for still a year more in Congress and had a bill passed which gave the states self-rule, and was one of the first to help get up the Declaration of Independence and to sign it. It was his help more than that of those who worked with him that passed it, for there were some men who tried to balk him in it and have the scheme thrown out. Jefferson gave him all the praise for it, and said that had it not been for him, the Declaration would not have been signed. 2 years from this time he was one to form a new set of laws for his own state of Massachusetts. He was sent to France to get up a law that would leave their ports and those of England free for our goods. He had the luck to have his bill signed, though he had to work hard for it, and then came home, where he was met with joy by the friends who had hoped long for the news he brought them. When Washington was made president, Adams was picked out as the best man in all the land as his chief aide in the rule of the states, and when Washington gained the chair for the next term of 4 years, Adams took the same place once more. In 1796, Mr. Adams was made president as he got the most votes that were cast. Jefferson was the one who ran with him for the place and lost it by but 3 votes. He was then made vice president. Adams kept all the aides that Washington had and made no change, though some of these did not suit his mind. It was not till 3 years from that time that he took John Marshall on his staff to look to the laws of the states. When Adams ran once more for the presidency, he lost it by 8 votes, and Thomas Jefferson took the chair to rule for 4 years. From the time that Adams left his place as head of our land, it seemed as if all his old friends turned from him, and that foes new and old seemed to spring up for him on all sides. The law that he had passed to seize and keep out of our states all who came here from strange lands made him foes. Those who had once been stirred by the sound of his voice turned from him. His name had no weight in the land. It could not move the minds of the crowd who once had been proud of him. At his home he wrote a book of his life, but he did not live to write the last of it. His death was at Quincy, Massachusetts, on the 4th of July, 1826, which, strange to say, was the same day that Jefferson went to meet his God. Ere Adams died, he had the good luck to see his son take his place as the head of the land in the chair he had once held. End of section 2. Read by Inkel.
Section 3 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wes Putnam. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 3, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who was our third president, was born at Shadwell, Virginia in 1743. Though said to have had as a boy no grace of face or form, he still gave hopes that at some time he would be a great man, for he was quite apt to learn. At 9, he was quite well read, and knew some Greek. 8 years from that time, he went into a high class at William and Mary College. Here, he spent most of his time in hard work, and would read up in his books for the whole day, and at times far in the small hours of the night. He soon knew the speech of all lands of his day, and got much praise from those who taught him. While at this school, he was a friend to Patrick Henry, who was known in time as one who could sway the hearts of men with his words. He spoke in a grand way when our first war broke out, and did much to stir up all that was brave in our land. In time, Jefferson had a 5 years course at law, and was one of the bar. He soon let all know of what good stuff he was made. His fees were large, and in a year he made friends right and left. In 1760, he heard Patrick Henry's great speech on the Stamp Act. 2 years from that time, he took his seat in Congress, and step by step he rose to be a great man in the land. He had so fine a mind that he soon took the lead of all in that great band. He swayed the minds of all in the most grave things that came up, and showed that he was wise. It was he who helped draw up the Declaration of Independence that made us free. It was the fruit of his great mind and thought, and his name would live for that if he had not done a thing more for our land. Some months from the time he made the draft of this great scroll, he left Congress to take a part in the acts of his own state, and for 2 years and a half he gave up his time to fix on a safe plan her laws and rules, so that they would be more just and kind to all men. When the men of his state saw what he had done to help them, they made him, in 1779, the governor of Virginia. He came to the chair next to his old friend, Patrick Henry, and he held it through those dark days of the war when all hearts were full of pain and fear. He did much to raise the hopes of all, and was a kind and just man to those who sought his help in the hour of need. You may well think that in this time that tried men's souls, he had his hands full of work. To watch those of his own state who had gone to the war, to care for those at home, and to keep the Indians back when they sought to prey on those who had to live on the edge of the state. All this he had to do and more. Yet in all that he tried, he won in the end. He stopped the raids of his foes and saw that no one who was born in the state should come to want through the war. Jefferson was president 8 years and would not take a new term as the head of his state, though it was the wish of all that he should. He gave as his views that they were in need of a man just at that time who had more skill in the art of war than he, one who knew more how to guard their lands when dark days should come. 2 days from the time that he left his seat, his home and farm were laid waste by the foe, and he and his wife had scarce time to flee to a safe place. For 12 days the state had no head, and the men that had met with the view to name one who should take Jefferson's place had to fly from the foe that came in a swarm from west and north. Some years later, Jefferson was twice sent to France to try and make terms of peace for our land and England, and at last got them to pass a bill in which they said they would look on our land as free. This was a great thing for us to gain, and Jefferson had much praise for what he had done to bring it round. In Congress that year, he brought a bill which was put in force. This gave us a coin of our own make in place of that made by the English, which had till then been in use. Jefferson had been one of Washington's aides when he was made president and had charge of the states. He had not been long in this place ere Hamilton, whose work was to take care how the coin was made for the land, got in a broil of words with Jefferson. This in time grew to be a strong feud twixt the two men. From what we can learn, it was not the fault of Jefferson, for he was a man known to be sweet and kind to his friends. It all came from the fact that he did not hold the same views as Hamilton on some points in the state laws. Hamilton thought all was done to spite him. Time went on, and, slow but sure, the breach grew wide twixt these men, who should have been friends. Then folks took sides with the two men, and they were known as Republicans and Federalists. These two bands live to this day with much the same names. Republicans then are Democrats now, and the then Federalists are the Republicans now. When England had a war with France, Jefferson wished to lend aid to the French, but Hamilton thought it best for our land not to take sides. So there were some storms of words from both. There were 2 news sheets put in print each day, one on the side of Hamilton and one for Jefferson. Louisiana was bought in the time of Jefferson, and our fleets won the day in the sea of the Mediterranean. Peace was made with Morocco and Tripoli, and they were forced from that time to treat all men from this land in the right way, and not seize them and their goods as they had done. Jefferson was president for 8 years, that is, 2 terms. When votes were cast for him, Aaron Burr and he had the same sum of votes, so Burr was made vice president. Aaron Burr was a man of great gifts and a fine mind, but he had weak points that led him wrong. He fought and killed Hamilton in July 1804. This act stirred up the rage of the folk, so that he had to fly from their wrath. He took up a wild scheme to make a grand stir in the world. His plan was to found a sort of throne in Mexico, where he should rule with more pomp and state than a king. To help this plan, he made friends of a rich man named Blennerhassett and his wife, and they gave him a great part of their wealth to aid his wild dream. He meant, it was said, to bring states south and west into his realm. For this they took him and tried him at Richmond in 1807, but did not prove the charge and let him go. He went to London and lived there as a poor man for a time. Then he came back to New York and took up the law once more, but his day was done, and he died a poor man. Jefferson held to state rights with all his might, but in the late years of his life, he said that there were times when the government should show its teeth. One thing took place while Jefferson held the chair of state, and that was when the first steamboat was made by Robert Fulton. We had had all kinds of ships, but none that went by steam, and all were glad that a means had been found to use that great force. The first boat built to go by this means did not look at all like those we have in use on the streams and lakes of our times. It could not go near so fast, not more than 5 miles per hour when at its best speed. Fulton did not find his task a light one to prove that steam was the best thing with which to move a boat. The folks had a mind to scoff and jeer at his plans, and it was not till his boat, the Clermont, was tried that they felt what a great work he had done. The trip of the Clermont up the Hudson made a good deal of stir as it passed in a cloud of smoke and sparks up the stream. Men were scared when they first saw it pass, but they soon learned the good work that steam might do. When Jefferson was at the head of his state, he sought to do 3 things. First, to put an end to the slave trade. Next, to have lands left to all the heirs of a house, and not to the firstborn son. And third, to let all men have a right to serve God in their own way. In the great school that he built, he thought it best to trust the young men and not to spy on them. He did not hold strict views of faith, and was a man of free thought, though he had trust in Christ. He was for free trade to the end of his life. He held that a man that could not read or write should not have a vote, as he thought the land should be ruled by wise men. Books were at all times his friends, and he was fond of Greek verse. In his home he was loved by young and old. He had a warm heart and a cool head. He was so poor at one time that he had to sell his books. Congress bought them and took them to Washington. There were such loads of them that it took days to take them to their new home. Jefferson was a man of plain tastes and wore plain clothes. He did not care for pomp and state and had no taste for names of rank. He was kind to all who came to speak with him. He held that it was wrong to keep slaves. In his home at Monticello, to which he went when he left the White House, he kept a free house where he was glad to meet all his friends and give them the best he had. His wife had brought him much wealth in land and slaves, but he died poor, for he dealt it all out with a free hand. When he was 80 years old, he was still strong and could ride on a horse 10 miles a day. The time drew near for his strength to fail, but his mind was clear. He grew more weak and said, as he lay on his bed, that the scenes of the Revolution came to him from time to time. He said he felt no fear of the end. I am like an old watch, he said. A spring is worn out here, a wheel there, and it cannot go long. This is the 4th? He said to a friend who sat by his bed. The friend bent his head. Ah, said Jefferson, and a glad look came to his face. He died on the 4th of July, 1826, and on that same day, one more great man from this life in the state of Massachusetts. This was John Adams, whose son was president. A rough sketch was left by Jefferson of a stone to mark his grave. He wished men to know that he had formed the Declaration of Independence. He was the one who built the University of Virginia, a great school for young men which stands to this day. He was so poor when he died that all his lands were sold in a short time, and the ground where he was laid went with the rest. Next to Washington, he is said to have been the best chief of a free land that the world has known. End of section 3. Read by Wes Putnam, Indian Land, South Carolina.
Section 4 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bruce McCready. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 4, James Madison, 1809 to 1817. James Madison had more votes than C.C. Pinckney, and so he was our fourth president. He was born in Virginia in 1751. While he was yet a boy in years, he went to school at Princeton College, New Jersey, which stands to this day. When he left school, he took up the law, and in 5 years was made one of the first in his state. He lost his place on the next vote, for he would not buy up those who could place him in the chair. 2 years from that time he was sent to Washington and soon took a lead in the laws of our land, and grew to be one of the great men of his day, feared by his foes and loved by all who had the good of the states at heart. He, too, made one of that brave band of men who met to make up the Declaration of Independence, and did much to bring it out. His voice and pen gave their aid to put it through, and much praise is due him for his work in this cause. He was the right-hand man of President Jefferson, who made him Secretary of State, and he served in this place for a term of 8 years, and all said that he did well while there. In 1809 he was made president, and soon from the time he went in, he made a tour of all the posts from east to west and south to north, to see if they were strong in case there should be a new war in the land. When he came in, he found that our land was not pleased with England. The cause of this was that England would stop our ships on the sea and search them, which they thought was not just. So at last war once more broke out, and at first all went wrong with us. The red men took sides with the foe, and a great chief of theirs, of the name of Tecumseh, tried to form a plan to join all the Indians in a war on the whites. He was a brave man and fought hard in the fight, but at last he fell, and with him his cause. Though we did not win much on the land, we had good luck in all our fights on the sea. It was in one of those fights that the words, "Don't give up the ship," were first heard from the lips of one who got his death wound on the deck of his ship. In one of the great sea fights we had 9 ships on our side, and there were 6 on that of the foe. We fought so well that it was not long ere the British lost all their ships. When it was a sure thing that we had won, Perry, who led our ships, wrote home, "We have met the foe, and they are ours." There was a war now for 3 years, and in the last of it the British took some of our towns on the south coast and marched into Washington. Madison and his aides had been on the field of war all day, and when they saw that there was no chance for them, they rode back to Washington to save all they could. Mrs. Madison had a cartload of things packed up to go off with when she thought of the great portrait of Washington which hung on one of the walls of the president's room. The frame was too large to take down, so the shrewd lady cut the canvas from its frame and took it with her in safety. The English troops came in and set fire to the president's house and the State House, and in fact to all the town. They next went to Baltimore to take that city, but were forced to leave with great loss. Fort McHenry guards the city. Francis Scott Key had gone on board one of the ships with a flag of truce to see if the English would let off some men taken at Washington. He was kept on the English ship while the fight went on. When it stopped at night, Key had to wait till dawn to see if the flag was still on the fort. On the deck of that ship where he passed the night, with no thought of sleep, he made up the song of the Star-Spangled Banner, since one of our great songs, and which should be known by all boys and girls in the land. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at twilight's last gleaming? Oh, say does the star-spangled banner yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? They tried to make a raid on New Orleans, but General Jackson, who had charge of the town, built up miles of breastworks with bales and fought back of them with his men, so that the foe could not get near the place, though they tried hard to do so. This was the last fight that took place in this war, and when peace was made, both sides were glad of it. Peace was signed at Ghent, December 24th, 1814. From that day, England had no right to make a search in our ships, and we have been at peace. Madison, when his first term of 4 years as head of our land was through, was put in the chair for 4 more years. So much was he liked by all. In this last term, Madison gave his seal to a bill which gave the right to form a great bank for the whole land, to last a score of years. On the 4th of March of 1817, he went back to his home for rest and peace from the hard work he had gone through. But it was not long ere he was heard once more in the halls of the law. In 1829, he was one who had in charge the change that was to be made in the code of laws for the whole land. He died at his home in Montpelier, in Virginia, June 28th, in the year 1836. End of section 4. Section 5 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bruce McCready. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 5, James Monroe, 1817 to 1825. James Monroe, the 5th President of our land, was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, in the year 1758. His father held large tracts of lands in that part of the state, where he grew all kinds of grains and herbs that are found in the South, and was a man of some wealth. As he had means, he gave his son James a good chance to learn at school, so that he did not have to work and teach while there to make what he lived on. When war broke out in 1776, Monroe, though not much more than a boy in years, joined our troops at the first call to arms and at once proved what was in him. He was a brave youth, and it was not long ere Washington made him the head of a part of his troops for the good work he had done in the fight. Monroe fought at White Plains and Harlem Heights and was much praised for his share in what was done there. When the first great fight took place at Trenton, he got his first wound from a spent ball that laid him up for some time. For his brave acts, he was raised to a still more high place in the charge of our troops. At the famed fights of Monmouth and Brandywine, he still held his place as one of the most brave men that went out to fight for our just cause. He was at all times the first man to lead the way to the foe, and the last to give up all hope and flee when the tide of war turned the wrong way. 2 years from the time he took up arms to save his land, he tired of the noise of war and the clash of arms, and went back once more to his old life and to learn law with Thomas Jefferson. He got on well from the start, and it was but a few years from the time he made his start in this new line that we hear of him as one of the first in the land. At his state convention, he would not give his aid to pass the laws, which he said gave too much strength into the hands of the government. Since he took this view of the case, he joined a band of men who held much the same views as the Republican Party of our own times. In 1790, he was made senator for a term of 4 years. At the end of this time, he went to France to look out for our rights there, but he was called back in 2 years from his work. This was done, it is said, from the fact that he took a part with the Republicans in France and did not tend to that which he had been charged with by our land. When he came back, he was made the head of the state of Virginia and served as such for 3 years. He was then sent to France once more to buy the state of Louisiana from the hands of the French. He bought this vast tract of land from Napoleon for the sum of $15 million, which was a small price for such a large place, though it was in a rough, wild state at that time. Monroe was sent twice to Spain and to England. He then went back to the place of his home life, for he could say with truth that he had well earned a time of rest. It was not long ere he was called to take part once more in the stir and noise of the times. He was made governor of Virginia, then one of the first aides to President Madison, and at last, to crown all, he was named for president by the Democrats and got the most votes, which gave him the first place by the laws of our land. His rule was much like that of the man whose place he took, and it must be said that his task was not so hard as some who had held the chair. Peace had come to us. The storm of war was heard no more. The roar of guns was dead. The corn and grass had sprung up on the graves of our men who were slain in the fight, and birds sang once more where shot and shells had brought death. The first thing Monroe did was to pay off the great debt which the war had brought on, and it was not long ere he had paid up to a cent what was due, and wiped the claim out. When this was done, our trade at once grew in size, and our ships with loads of goods were seen once more to dot the sea with their white sails. The hopes of all seemed to rise. The land smiled with fields of grain, and the wheels of our mills were at work both day and night. It had been a hard thing at times to get this grain and things from the towns and farms far from the streams or the sea to where it could be sold. For this reason, a long place like a trench was dug all the way from Buffalo to Albany, so that the Hudson could fill it, and by this means boats could go back and forth from this place to that, with their loads in a much more short way than by land. The first railroad was built, too, at this time, for the same cause. This year, the Indians in the South grew fierce and went in for war. Joined by some blacks, they tried to rob and burn the homes of our folks in the wild parts of the States. General Jackson, at length, with the aid of a small force of troops, made his way into their midst and forced them to lay down their arms and come to his terms. 2 Englishmen, whom General Jackson thought had tried to stir up the Indians to fight, were hung by him, and though his foes sought to bring shame on him for this act, Monroe said he had done right. About this time, the King of Spain gave Florida to us, and we in turn gave up Texas and paid a large sum to the Americans there for what they had been robbed of by Spain. Mississippi, Alabama, Maine, and Illinois were made states in Monroe's term, and Arkansas Territory was named. Missouri was made a state late in the year 1817. This was when the famed bill, the Missouri Compromise, came up. The great point was that no one should hold slaves in it when a state. This the South did not like, and fought, not with arms, but by a war of words to make it a slave state, for they feared the North would get too strong if they had all their own way. At last, Congress let Missouri come in as a slave state, but made a law that a line should be drawn in the land, and that north of this line no one should hold slaves. There were but a few slaves held at this time, but the trade grew and grew until all states south of this line held them. All were pleased by the way Monroe served as head of the land, and when the votes were cast in 1820, they chose him for a term of 4 years more to fill the chair and hold the reins of the state's laws. 2 years from this, some states in South America said they would not bear the yoke of strange lands, that they would be free. The United States took part with them in this, and held the same views, that they should form a republic of their own. Monroe said in 1823 that they should be looked on as such, and that America should not bear the yoke the lands in the Old World sought to place on them. This view, which he took, was known from that day to this as the Monroe Doctrine. In 1825, Monroe left the cares of the state and sought rest and peace and home life at Oak Hill, Virginia. He died on the 4th of July, 1831, in New York, and left a name that may well be placed by that of Washington and Jefferson as one who worked well for the good of his land and fought the brave fight in her hour of need. End of section 5.
Section 6 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 6. John Quincy Adams, 1825 to 1829. On July 11th, 1767, in Braintree, Massachusetts, where the town of Quincy now stands, was born John Quincy Adams. 2 streams of the best blood in the land ran in the veins of the child, and it was not strange that in time to come he grew to be a great man. He had one of the best starts in life that a boy could have. All of his race were brave and wise, and came of the best stock to be found through all the length and breadth of the States. He was the son of the great John Adams, who took the chair next to Washington. The war with England held full sway when he was a boy, and the first sound his ears heard was the roar of guns, and he saw the smoke of the fight, for the town where they had their home at one time was quite in the seat of war. When he was a boy of some 9 years of age, he would ride by post to the source of the fight, and bring what news there was to his folks at home. You may know that as the war went on so near his home, he did not have much of a chance to go to school, but he was apt to learn, and heard and saw much that in the years to come was of just as much use to him, if not more, as that which he might have read in books. When he was not much more than 10 years of age he went to France to school, and we are told that he wrote of his trip and what took place there down in a book, so that when he grew old he might look back and see what he did when a boy. Though he spent his school life in the most gay town of France, yet he did not fall in too bad ways, as most boys would have done who found they were their own lords in a strange land. When he came back to his own home once more, he was much the same boy who had gone from there some few years since. He had not changed in the life he had led in strange lands. His heart was still bound up in his dear old home and those who lived there. He at once read up, when he got home, all the books that fell in his way, and in a short time had stored his mind so that he could go to Harvard College, where he went through each course by the year 1787. He made up his mind, when through school, to take up law and make it the work of his life. So it is not long from this time that we find him at this in Boston. He soon wrote screeds for the news sheets of the day, which gave him some fame, so that men would talk of his name and ask who he was. Some of the things which he wrote had for their aim Tom Paine, who wrote a book in which he sought to prove that there was no God, and that the church was wrong. In 1794 he was sent o'er the sea to stand for the rights of our folk in the land of the Dutch. He stayed there for some time, and was then sent to Portugal for the same good work, and thence to Berlin, where he found there was much to be done. It was his chief work while there to bring round peace between Prussia and his own land, and when this was done he came back home and took up law at the old place where he got his first real start in life. In 1802 he was sent to the Senate, which at that time was much sought for by men of brains and mind, for it led to some things that were worth while as an aim in life. While here, he had a chance to show of what good stuff he was made, for he was down on all bills that he thought might bear down too hard on the poor in the land, which were brought in by a few men who hoped to get rich. As he was such a good man who dared to do right, of course there were some bad men who tried to do him harm when they got a chance, but he fought them down one by one. He was once sent over to Russia to act for our land there, but he came back in a short time. When he came home it was to take a high place in the state, near the new President, James Monroe. He went to Washington to live, which at that time was but a group of houses on a waste of sand. It was a great change for him to be raised to such a high place in the laws of his land, but he stood the test well, and his foes could not but say that he was the right man in the right place. 4 names were put up for president at this time: J.Q. Adams for the East, W.W. Crawford in the South, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay West. On March 4th, 1825, he was made president and J.C. Calhoun vice president. Henry Clay had the charge of the funds. One of the great things that took place while he was in was the first railroad that was built. It was but 3 miles in length, and the cars were drawn by a horse, not steam. The first steam car, when it came in use from England, was a poor sort of thing. It could not go fast, and at first it used to scare off the cows and sheep on the farms it went by, and those who lived near the track thought their last hour had come for sure, though in time they did not mind it at all. Canals were made in New York at this time. Henry Clay, who had a high place in the time of J.Q. Adams, was born in Virginia, and was a poor boy. He went to a small log school house to learn his first tasks, but he rose to be one of the first in the land. He spoke with such strength and force as well as grace that he could sway the minds of all men. He used to learn by heart what he read when a boy and speak it, and he thought that was one way in which he had gained so much ease. He says, "I made more than one offhand speech in the cornfields or in the woods where but an ox or horse could hear me." It was said of Clay that on his tomb one might write these words: "Here lies one who led men for years by the mere force of his mind, yet who was not known to swerve from the truth or call in lies to help him." In the strife of North and South on slave laws, Henry Clay made more than one great speech to try and keep the peace. DeWitt Clinton, who in 1812 had run for president against Madison, was one of the great men of his age. He was chief of the state of New York and took great thought on the Erie Canal and did much to make it a thing of fact. It was a great thing for the whole Union when the boats found they could reach the ocean through the state. Clinton was brought in a barge down from Lake Erie to the city of New York, and had with him a pail of lake water, which was thrown into the sea, and it was said to be the wedding of the lakes and the ocean. It was while Adams was in the chair that there was much talk of a tax that was to be put on all goods that were brought here from far lands, and we hear a good deal of it to this day. There were some who thought it was wrong, and some who thought it was the best thing. Adams went in for a high tax, which was the first cause why he did not hold the chair for more than one term. He once more had a high place in 1830, when he was sent from his state to Washington. He died at his home in Quincy, November 23rd, 1848. His last words were, "This is the last of earth. I am glad." End of section 6, read by Inkel.
Section 7 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mark Dykeshorn in November 2022. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 7, Andrew Jackson, 1829 to 1837. Andrew Jackson was the son of a poor man who died when the boy was but a few days old. His life while he was a child was full of hard work. He did not care for books, and in those days there were few that would please a child. When the war with England broke out, he fell at one time into the hands of the foe. He was then a youth with a will of his own, as he showed when he was bade to clean some boots. He said it was not the place of a free-born American to clean British boots. He was not meek or mild, and to be told to do such work made his blood boil. He kept his word in spite of hard blows, and at last the man shot him, and he was thrown in jail with a wound. There he got the smallpox. He knew not where to turn when he came out of jail, for he was poor, and there was no one left to help him. But he made his way with a brave heart, though he had more than one fight in his time, and could show scars that were not won in war. He had a great hate for England, as he lost those near and dear to him through the war with that land. He tried to learn a trade, but at last made up his mind to take to the law. He was gay, fond of a race or a cockfight, and yet he made out to get on in some way. In our days, a boy needs to learn much more to get to the bar than then, and it cost less in those days. A boy who worked on the farm in the warm months could learn as much in the cold time of the year as the schools could give him. To a young man who wished to rise, the first step was to learn law, so that grew to be the first grand aim of a boy's heart. It is said that Jackson did not make much of the law, as he had not the sort of mind to rise in that line, and he did not choose to be a drudge on a farm or at a trade. He went with a friend to the state of Tennessee in 1788. The class of men who lived there then were those who first broke the path in the wild woods, and they were more fond of drink than of work. They were at all times in strife, and liked to go to law. Drink and debt and fight filled the land. Jackson had a post in which it was his task to find out the rights and wrongs of things, and try and bring in law to set them straight. The red men, too, were on the warpath, as they did not wish to give up their land. Jackson went on his way, though at times as he rode up and down to do his work he risked his life, for he made strong foes, though he won strong friends. He fought in the war with England, and built up the breastworks in New Orleans, from the back of which the men fired and won the day. He was sent to Washington from his state, but he did not care for his life there, and formed no ties that it was hard to break. It was said that at that time he was a tall, lank man with no grace. His long locks of hair hung down his face, and his queue in the back was tied with an eel skin. His dress was strange, and all his ways those of a rough man from the backwoods. More late in life he learned the ways of the best-bred folks in the land, but he felt in such a strong way on all points, and was so rash that when he rose to speak in the Senate, he would choke with rage, so he did not do much in that line. He was made judge of the court in his own state, but naught is known of his acts at that time. He then went home and spent some years in work, but by no means in peace. He was at all times one who held out for what he thought his rights, and this oft led to strife. More than once he called out the man he thought his foe, and the aim of each was to kill. In one of these fights, Jackson got a wound which made him weak for life, and in one he had a ball put in him which he bore for a score of years. But when the Creek War came with the red men, and then a war with England, Jackson showed that though he was not good to keep the peace, he had the right sort of stuff in him to lead in war. He did not want to mind, though, but would be head, and he showed that he was strong, and that he could bear all kinds of hard work and not give up. He knew how to sway his men and make them do his will, and he did not know what it was to tire while there was aught to be done. The young men of the state made haste to list with him, and his ranks were kept well filled. Those who had fought with him had great tales to tell, and were made much of when they got home. Though he was most strict, and some thought hard, he did not fear to do what he thought was right, though all sought to hold him back. From the time when he put an end to the Creek War, the fame of Jackson dates. At New Orleans, where the English sought to strike a great blow, he was on hand, so that they met with great loss. While he was president, there were some at the South who felt that the North had more than its share of wealth and land. There were more great mills and more goods made at the North than at the South. There were some who made a plan to cut loose and set up a new band of states. They had all their young men drilled for war, and got arms, and chose a man to lead them. His name was John C. Calhoun, and he was to be their first chief. But Jackson said, "If a state could go out of the Union when it chose, our land would come to naught." And he sent troops and ships of war, and put a stop to all that sort of thing in a short time. There was a tribe of red men in Florida who did not wish to lose their land and give way to the white man. They fought for a long time in the swamps of that land. Slaves who had fled from their homes were with them. One of the chiefs had a slave girl for a wife, and when she went with him to one of the forts she was seized and kept as a slave, and the chief was put in chains. He made a vow that he would fight the white man as soon as he was free. So he led his tribes to war. His name was Osceola. They took him at last, and kept him in one of the forts till his death. But the war went on for years, at a great cost of life, till few of that tribe were left in the land. When the English left New Orleans, Jackson still kept all the troops up to the mark. He was thought a hard man, as he let no fault go, and he had men shot who left their posts or went home when they had no leave. But in this, though he seemed hard, he was wise, and he had to keep up the laws of war. At the same time, the one who was the most hard to rule was Jackson's own self. He was quick to get into strife, and had more foes than he could count. But from the time he was made president, the land gained strength each year. Steamboats came more in use, and more railroads were built. All were proud of their president. They felt, "He is one of us. He stands by us. He does not care for style, but for what is sound and strong and good." There was much strife in his time as to a tax on wool, steel, wine, and a long list of things. Some thought that it was best for those who made goods here to have all taxed that were made in strange lands. In Jackson's time there was a great bank built which had the name of the Bank of North America. This was the cause of strife. State banks were not liked at that time, as it was thought they did not deal in a fair way with all sorts of men, but did the best for their friends. This bank was to be for the whole land, and it had large funds. It was built in Philadelphia. In the first 2 years it went far to make things worse than they were. It took the lead in all sorts of wrong jobs with the shares, and it plunged the land in hard times. There was what was called a bank war. Some had no faith in that sort of bank, and brought more than one charge to show that it did not deal in the right way. There was a great deal of this strife through both terms while Jackson was president, but at last the great bank came to an end, and crowds of those who were in high place in the land lost all they had. Mexico set its slaves free in 1824. Texas was brought in the Union, and through all this term the growth of the land was great. But as it reached its end, there were strikes and strife of all kinds. The high price of food was the cause of mobs. Rents, too, were more than the poor men could pay. At one time flour and wheat were seized by a mob. Troops had to be called out to keep the peace. This was just at the end of Jackson's term. Jackson took good care of his friends, and put them in good posts, and to make way for them moved out 690 folks in his time. He went out with a glad heart, and set forth at once for his old home. On the way he was met with all the old marks of love by friends. He was still a great strength in the land. He died June 8th, 1845. He had all the fame that he could have dreamed of in his youth. What he had set his heart on he had gained. His foes were all brought low. In his last years he joined the church and died at peace with all men. End of section 7.
Section 8 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 8. Martin Van Buren, 1837 to 1841. Van Buren was born at Kinderhook, New York, in 1782. He did not get a chance to go much to school when a boy, but made the most of his time while there. He took up law when he was quite a young man, and in 1821 was sent from his state to Washington, and in 6 years or more they chose him to be the head man of New York State. When he was placed in the chair by the will of our land, he at once put an end to the war with the Indians. When he took his seat, hard times were at hand, and all trades were at a low ebb. In a few months from the day he took the oath, all the banks in New York gave up and would pay no more in gold and coin, and the banks in not a few of the states did the same thing. Crowds of men were thrown out of work, and the streets were full of those who had naught to do. Trade was at a standstill, and the price of food and clothes rose at once. Yet no one could blame Van Buren for the state things were in. He did but reap what had been sown by those who had gone. He said that one cause of these hard times was that folks had lost the plain tastes of the old times and spent too much, so they must bear it. Late in the year of 1837, those who lived in Canada tried to set up laws of their own and to have a home rule. There were not a few in our land who took sides with them, and a large force of men from New York went to their aid, but they were soon put down. For a while, it seemed that our peace with England was at an end, and that a new war would spring up. Van Buren at once said that no man in our land should aid the cause of those in Canada, or they should be put in jail. So at last the fear of a new war was put down by these means. Van Buren ran once more for his seat as the head of our land, but lost it this time. Harrison was the one who took his place. There were great times at the race as to who should rule next. Van Buren was rich and had been president 4 years. Harrison was poor, but made a great name in the Indian wars. The race was said to be the log cabin against the White House, and those who went for Harrison drank a great deal of cider. It was called the hard cider race. Van Buren died at his old home at Kinderhook, July 24, 1862, near 80 years of age. End of section 8, read by Carrie Adams, your book voice. at Mesa, Arizona, on the 10th of August, 2022.
Section 9 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 9. William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, 1841 to 1845. Harrison, our 9th president, was born in Virginia in 1773. He was the son of a good and learned man, who gave his boy all the chance to go to school and learn that he could wish. Harrison was fond of books when but a child in years, and was more apt than most of his age to learn his tasks. He was quite a youth when he got through school and took up arms in the Indian War. But he had a man's heart in his breast that bade him go forth and fight for his home and the good cause of his land. He showed so much pluck in this war that he was soon placed at the head of some troops, where he still kept his name up as a brave man. When he had had 6 years of war, he gave up his place to rest at home for a while. But he was soon asked by some of the states to take his seat in Congress. He had made governor of Indiana for 3 terms. So much was he liked by those who lived in the state. He made peace with the Indians for a time, and when they went on the warpath once more, he put them to rout at Tippecanoe. For his brave work in this fight, he was made general, and in our fight with the British at the Thames, he gained the best of them. Tecumseh, the chief of the Indians, whom Harrison whipped at Tippecanoe, was the most able red man of his time. If he had been brought up in our days and had our chance at school, he would have been a very great man. He was very brave, too. One time he was asked to call on Harrison and talk of the war and what should be done. Harrison sat on a chair with all his aides round him, and Tecumseh saw there had been no place fixed for him. He showed he did not like this, and one of the aides brought in a chair and said, "Your father asks you to sit by his side." Tecumseh drew his wrap round him and said, "The Great Spirit is my father, and I will repose on the bosom of my mother," and sat down on the ground. Harrison ran in 1836 for president, but did not get the most votes. 4 years from that time, he was named once more for the place, and this time won by a great vote. But he did not live long to reap the fruit of his hard work in the cause of his land. He took his seat as the head of our states on March 4th, 1841, and just 1 month from that time he died. John Tyler, who had been his vice president, was then sworn in and took the chair. John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, was the son of the governor of Virginia, in which state he was born in 1790. When through with school, he took up law and was soon sent to Congress, where he stayed for 5 years and was then made the head of his own state. He was made vice president with Harrison, and then president. He had not been long in his seat ere a strife broke out in Rhode Island. It seems by the old laws no one who did not hold land could vote, and as this was not thought fair to all, they wished to have it changed. There was a split as to how this should be done. One side was led by a man named King, and called themselves the Law and Order Party. The rest had Thomas Dorr as their head, and both sides made up their minds to have their own way and form laws of their own. King's men tried to put down those led by Dorr, but they would not have it, and sought to seize the fort, where the state arms were held. The troops were sent out to put a stop to this, and Dorr had to flee for his life from the state. In a few months he was caught and put in jail for life, but he was soon freed and let go once more. Tyler had scarce got through and put down the strife ere more broke out in the state of Missouri. Smith, the Mormon, with many more of his own kind, took up a vast tract of land in this state as their home, and those who lived there sought to drive them out. Our troops were sent out, and at last Mormons were sent out of the state and made their home in Illinois. But it was not long ere they were mixed up in some kind of strife, as they had gone through, and at last they had to flee out in the wilds of the far west. They are now at Salt Lake City. The war broke out this year in Texas. For a long time, none of our folks had built their homes there, since it was owned by Mexico. But this year, hosts flocked there from other states, and made up their minds to stay, if they had to fight for it. The Texans fought with the Mexicans at Gonzales in this year, and though they were but half as large a force as the foe, they soon put them to rout. In 1836, a Texan fort, known by the name of the Alamo, was won by the Mexicans, and all in its walls were killed in cold blood. The great fight at Jacinto the next month, in which the Texans won, gave them the state in their own lands. They now asked that their state should be made one of the Union, and in 1845 this took place. Tyler tried hard to be placed in the chair once more for a term of 4 years, but his hopes were vain, as Polk was to be the next to hold the reins of state. So he soon went home to find rest from his work. The last year of Tyler's rule, a great thing was found out by Samuel F. B. Morse. By the means of a wire stretched from pole to pole through the land, he could send words for miles and miles in a flash, quite as fast as it would take one to think of it. And soon from town to town we could hear what went on there in less than no time. On these wires, for the first time, was flashed the news that James Polk was to take the chair of state when Tyler left it. Tyler died in Richmond, Virginia, in January 1862. Daniel Webster died on the same day as Clay. He was at the head of the state at the time of Tyler and Harrison. He was a great man. He had not much chance to go to school when he was a boy, for he was poor. He did not go but for a few weeks, and showed none of the great gifts of speech for which he grew famed. he was so shy that he could not speak a piece in the school. He learned law, and when he made a speech, all wished to hear, for they knew he would bring much wealth of thought, as well as what he had gained in books, to bear on the theme. When his death was known, there was grief in the land, for a great man gone. End of section 9. Section 10 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Henry W. Pierson. Chapter 10. James Knox Polk, 1845 to 1849. James Knox Polk was born in North Carolina in 1795, where his first years were spent on a large farm. He went to school a good deal when a boy, and when he left, took up law. He was soon sent to Congress, where he served for more than 10 years, and was then placed at the head of his state, where he was born. In 1845, he was made president, and it was not long from that time that he took his seat ere a war broke out in our land with Mexico. The cause of it was this. Our folks in Texas laid claim to a large tract of land, which those in Mexico said was theirs. General Taylor was sent with a force of troops at once to see that the rights of our state were kept up. On his way, he met the foe, drawn up in the road to stop him. But he had the good luck to rout them with the loss of but 9 men on his side. Taylor next laid siege to Monterey, their great city, and at last, when he had fought hard and long, got the town in his hands. The same year, Scott and his men drew siege lines round the town of Veracruz and sent bombs in it for 4 days, and at last it gave up the fight. But it was long ere peace was made with this land, and much blood had been spilled on her soil. In 1848 came news to our states in the East that there were gold mines in California. It was said that a man had found sand that was full of gold dust, and scarce was the news known ere a gold rush was made from all parts of the land to that state, and in fact from the whole world. A great deal of gold was found at the first, and this state soon grew to be a great one. 3 states came in while Polk ruled as the head of our land, and 2 of them were free states, or states where slaves could not be kept. At last a band of men, by the name of Free Soil men, took a stand that all slaves should be kept out of the new lands, which the United States might gain from time to time. Polk died in Nashville in 1849, when still a man in the prime of life. End of section 10.
Section 11 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 11. Taylor and Fillmore, 1849 to 1853. Zachary Taylor, our 8th president, was born in Orange County, Virginia, where his folks owned a large farm. Here he was brought up and went to school. When of age, he took up arms for his land in the war in the place of a friend. He was so brave in all the fights in which he took part that it was not long ere he rose from the ranks to a high place. In the Indian War, he won much praise for his work and was soon placed in charge. When the war broke out with Mexico, it was he who won the great fights at Palo Alto and Monterey, and he soon rose to be thought one of the great men, in fact, the first of his land. In each place that he went, he gained fame, and all gave him praise. When he came home, the streets through which he went were one blaze of light, and flags waved, while cheers rent the air as he came by on his brave horse. He was the man of the hour, and it was not strange that the will of the land should soon place him in the chair of state to rule us all. He just came in at a time when the strife as to the slave trade was at its height, but he did not hold his place but 4 months, as he took sick in the midst of his work and died July 9, 1850. Millard Fillmore. The vice president at once was sworn in and took up the reins of rule where they broke. He made as one of his aides the great Daniel Webster, whose charge it was to look to the rights and laws of the states. Fillmore, it might be well to say, was born in Cayuga County, New York, January 7, 1800. That part of the state where he had his home was in the midst of a dense tract of woods, where, one might say, for miles no man had trod. There was no house near his home, but one 4 miles off, so you may know he did not have much of a chance to go to school. When he was quite a boy in years, he was bound out to work to a man in a small trade. Here he stayed for 5 years, and at last got free from his toil as a bound boy, and set out for Buffalo on foot, where, in the course of time, he taught school to pay his way while he took up law. He soon gave up his school when he thought he could get on with what he knew of law, and made his way to a high place as one of the state bar. When Taylor died, as we have said, he was the president. It was not long from this time that there was a band of rough men from our land who made up their minds they would try and get Cuba in their hands, but it did not take long for them to be put down, and some of them were shot by troops of Spain. Fillmore died in Buffalo, March 8, 1874. End of section 11. Read by Carrie Adams, your book voice, at Mesa, Arizona, on the 10th of August, 2022.
Section 12 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 12. Franklin Pierce, 1853 through 1857. The next man to take the chair was Pierce, who had more votes than General Scott. He was born at Hillsborough, New Hampshire, in 1804, the son of the then head man of the state. Not much is known of his youth, but as he was not a poor boy, it is safe to say that he had a good chance to go to school. He was for years at Bowdoin College, Maine, till he left it to take up law and was soon made one of the bar. He made his old home the scene of his work, and soon grew to be thought a man of brains, who some day would lead in the laws of his land. And so it came to pass. While yet a young man in years, he was sent to high posts, and at last won the best gift in the hands of his land, the chief of all. When Pierce came in, the strife was still in force as to the slave trade. It did but make things worse when those who held slaves wished to bring them north of the line where it was said they should not be held by law. Where they wished to bring them was a large tract of land that was in time made up in two states, Kansas and Nebraska. The South said all they would ask was that all should have a vote to see if they had a wish to keep slaves or not in these new states. So Congress made a law which gave them the right to be slave or free states as they might wish. It was thought when this bill came to pass that we should have peace, but such was not the case. There were fights and broils on the day, and votes were cast, and much blood was spilled. One might say a small war took place in this state, with those who would have it free on the one side, and those who would hold slaves. Towns were burned, and for a long time there was a great fear this fight would spread through the land. At last, Kansas came in as a free state, and we had peace. In the time of Pierce, a great tract of land was bought from Mexico, and was known from that day to this as New Mexico. In the same year that this took place, the trade with Japan was made free to our ships, and a great show known as the World's Fair was held in New York in a great hall built of glass where all kinds of work done in the land were shown. Pierce died in Concord, Massachusetts on October 8, 1867, and left a name that all might look back on with love. In the fall of 1856, James Buchanan was the choice of the Democrats, and John C. Fremont was the chief of the new party called Republicans. Buchanan gained by a large vote. End of section 12, read by P.J. Travis.
Section 13 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 13. James Buchanan, 1857 to 1861. Buchanan was born in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, in 1791. He was the son of one who tilled the soil, and his first years were spent, of course, on the farm. When through school, he took up law, but did not try but one case while he was at the bar. It was a poor case, and he did not get a thing by it, but he won the suit, and put to rout those who sought to cheat his friend out of the land which had been left to her. When quite a young man, he was the choice of his state as one to make her laws, and 6 years from that date he was sent to Washington, where he held his seat for 10 years. He was sent by President Jackson to Russia in 2 years to look out for our rights in that land, and when he came back, went in our Senate House. In 1857, he was made president, and the first year he took his place, Utah would not bear the yoke of our laws, and sought to cast it off. At last, troops were sent out to force them to make peace, and they at last made terms and laid down their arms. The next year, Buchanan's rule was famed for one great feat that took place, and this was when Cyrus W. Field of New York laid the first wire through the sea so that words could be sent from our land to those in the Old World. Talk still ran high from the North to the South on the cause of the slave. The great case known as the Dred Scott case was tried by the Chief Justice, Taney, and he said that those who held slaves had a right to take them through with them all the free states, just when they chose. Few of them were held in the North, and it was on the large farms of the South where they were most to be found. So you may know the South wished with all their hearts that the slave trade might go on, while the North vowed that they would have none of it. In the fall of the year 1859, the fires that had long burned with a slow flame in the hearts of North and South burst forth, and John Brown of Kansas, the friend of the slaves, was the first to fan the blaze that was soon to sweep our land and drench its green fields with blood and fill its hills with graves. This Brown was a man who left his farm to serve the blacks. He was poor. He had worked in the fields for his bread. But his name will go down to those born in the years to come as one who did not fear to lay down his life for what he thought right. He was the first to strike a blow for the cause of the slaves. With a score of men, he held the fort at Harper's Ferry for 2 days. He seized on all the arms he found there, as it was his scheme to arm the blacks with them and lead them to fight the South and set their friends free. Troops were sent out to seize this man, who set at naught the laws of the land. With the small band of brave men with him, he fought as did the old Greeks in the years gone by, with no fear in his breast, though he knew too well his cause was lost, and that he must die. His 2 sons were shot down by his side, as he stood at the head of his band. But he did not pause. Still he kept a firm hand on his gun, and poured shot in the ranks of the troops. At length he fell with 6 wounds in the thick of the fight, but he did not die from them. He was hung, and on his way to the place where he was to give up his life, his last act was to kiss a babe in a slave's arms. But the torch that John Brown bore was not put out. It had fired the South and North with the fires of war. In 1860, South Carolina led the way, and a bill was passed which said that from that time they will not bear the laws of the Union, but would make their own laws. And it was not long ere 6 more states who liked the slave trade chose the same course that cut them off from the North. These states formed at last what was known as the Confederacy, and made Jefferson Davis their president. When Buchanan left the chair at the end of his term, he spent the last days of his life on a place near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he died in June of 1868. He wrote a book on his life, which is still in print. When the time came to choose a new president, and the South said, if Lincoln was made the choice of the North and the West, they would leave the Union. At the same time, there was a great split among the Democrats as to what the whole country should do. The Democrats as a party had won all their fights, and would in this case, if they had kept solid. They had 3 tickets in the field: Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois as the choice of one class, Breckinridge, the vice president with Buchanan, another, and John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts still another. This, of course, made them very weak, and Lincoln gained the prize. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Emily Schuler. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 14. Abraham Lincoln. 1861 to 1865. In a poor log house in Hardin County, Kentucky, Abraham Lincoln, or Abe as he was known through life, was born in 1807. His home was not as good as the barns of today, and stood in the midst of a dense wood where at night, when he lay on his bed, he could hear the growl of the wolves on the snow. Few of the folks who lived near could read or write, and there were no schools at that time where a boy might learn. One man who knew more than the rest used to take a few boys and girls to teach them for a small sum at his own house, and Abe, as we shall call him, when not much more than 6 years of age, was one of this class. From the first, Abe took to his books. School life pleased him the more and more he had of it, and he showed that he could learn with ease his tasks, hard as they might be. He could not get much help at home, as there were few there who read and wrote, and there were but 3 old books in the house, a church book, the Word of God, and one which taught how to spell. And yet it was not long ere the boy knew them all by heart. In the still hours of the night, by a dim light, he would work on at his books while the rest slept. So young in life were the first good seeds sown, that in the years to come were to reap for him fame and a name. When Abe had been scarce a year at school, he could read and write as well as most boys can at 12, and bade fair in a short time to know more than the man who taught him. But at this time his folks thought they would sell out and move to the far west, where land was cheap, and take a new farm. This was done, and Abe found that in his new home there was still less chance for him to go to school, as they were in the wilds where no man had set foot. Abe helped to chop down the trees that were to make the house, and though but 8 years of age, proved that he was of some use on a farm. As there was much game in the woods, it was not long ere he learned how to use a gun, and would often bring home at night wild fowl for them, so they knew there was no fear that they would starve in their new home. When they came to build their new log house, Abe was of great help, for there was no one they could call on for aid. The first house was 6 miles off. Soon more folks built near them, and a small town grew up in that wild place. So Abe had a chance to go to school once more. He was glad, for he had not found books to read in that wild spot, much as he wished for them. Books were so scarce in those days that Abe would go miles to get one of a friend if he thought it would be lent. The first he read in his new home was the Life of Washington, which made its mark on his mind and had much to do with the brave way he went through life and sought to do the right at all times. When a young man, Lincoln was hired to take charge of a flatboat filled with skins and furs to trade with the South. Abe was glad to go, for he had a strong wish to see the world of which he had dreamed and thought so much. There was much to be seen on this trip down the stream, but when it rained they had a hard time to keep dry and had to sleep at times in the wet. Lincoln was much pleased with all the new scenes that met his eye, and he was not glad when they got to the end of it and had sold their goods at a fair price. He was well paid by the one who hired him for the way he had made the trip, and praised for it. From that on, Lincoln was at times a raft man, or he split rails, and when a man in years took charge of a mill and store in the town of New Salem. At that time of which we write, it was thought a great time for a young man to have full charge of such a place, and he was looked on as a bright youth, who soon was the pride of the town. Abe's name was soon known in the place for truth, as he would not lie or strive to cheat when he made a trade. He had a bright way with him that took with men, and he was full of smart tales that made folks laugh when he told them by the fire at night. When there was no one in the store to buy, Lincoln read in some good book, for they were not so hard for him to get now. When the Black Hawk War broke out, at once he met the call for men and formed a small force of armed men in his own town of the young men of the place. He was placed in charge of these troops and marched at once to the seat of war, where he fought it out to the end and then walked home on foot. Lincoln was at this time a strong, well-formed young man, tall and not without some grace of his own. It is said he could lift a large keg by his hands and drink from the bunghole, which shows how great was his strength. One day, some young friends of his asked him if he would run for a place. He laughed at the thought of such a thing, but when he found they meant it, he said at last that he would run. He lost by a few votes of the count, which showed him at least that he had a host of friends in the place, as there were 3 smart men who ran with him for the same place. 2 years from that time he ran once more, and won by a great deal of votes, but he would not give beer or drinks for a vote. That was thought to be the way to win. Lincoln now took up law, and was soon made one of the bar. His first case was that of a poor boy who lay in jail. It was said for a crime he had done, and for which there was small hope that he would get off. Lincoln took charge of his case. He did not make a cent by it, but he set the boy free and sent him back to his home. In 1846, he took his seat in Congress, and for years he took the part of the slaves and signed all bills that came up which would help their cause. Lincoln's name was now known throughout the length and breadth of the land, and his views were sought at all times when a strong case came up to be judged. He sprang at once into the front rank of the great men of his day, and soon took the lead of them on points of law. All loved him for the good traits he had and for his fear of God, which he had shown from his youth up. Lincoln was a sad man, though he was famed for his wit and the fun of the tales he would tell. Yet all who saw his grave eyes and fixed sad mouth knew that in his heart he was not gay. He had at times what his friends knew as a black mood. It would seem as though a thought of his doom was with him all the while. He thought that he was meant for some great or sad end. He would talk of it in a calm way, and had felt sure of it all his life. To him it was his fate, and he could not be free from it. He felt that he was to fall from a high place. When he was made president, he said that he would not last through the term. When his friends wished to guard him from his foes, he would take no pains to do it. If they wished to kill me, he said, there was naught to keep them back. He did not wish a guard, but said, why stop up a gap when the fence is down all around? But though he spent most of his life in sad thoughts, he had a good side that made him like a laugh, and he was glad to chase his gloom. But the books he most read were of the sad kind, and what told of death and the grave, or the grief of men's days on earth, had the most charm for him. When he told a tale with wit in it, his sad face would change, and the mirth would spread till all the hard lines went out of it. The fun of it would dance in his eyes long ere he would reach the point of it. He would go a long way to find a man who could tell him a fresh thing in the way of fun, and hunt him up and swap jokes with him. They hand down good things, he told, in all the towns where he was wont to be, and they are heard to this day. It is said that his jokes were used to keep off his sad moods, and his mirth seemed to be put on. He was kind, but cold, not a man to hate with a deep, fierce hate, nor to love as a fond friend. He would use men as tools, and then think of them no more. He did not care much for great men, for he felt that he was as great as the best of them, and could do all that man could do. It was the aim of his heart to be right, and to do what was just to all men. He had not a great love for gold, and would not take a cent by wrong means. It was a day of gloom when Lincoln left Springfield to go to Washington, and a cold rain fell. When he got on the train, he went to the rear of the car and stood for some time in deep thought. His eye gazed with a sad glance at the crowd who were there to see him off, as though he would read their hearts. There was a tear in his eye as he saw them, it might be, for the last time. It seemed as though he could not speak, but at last he said a few words. He told them that none could know what he felt at that hour. He said, Here have I lived from my youth till now I am an old man. Here the ties most dear to me have been formed. Here my babes were born, and here one of them lies in a grave. To you, dear friends, I owe all that I have, all I am. All the strange past seems to crowd now on my mind. This day I leave you. I go to take up a task more hard than that which fell on Washington. If the great God who helped him shall not aid me, I shall fail. Let us pray that this God may not leave me now. To him I leave you all. Ask his help for me with all faith. With these few words I must leave you, for how long I know not. Friends, one and all, I must now bid you a fond good-bye. All were touched by these words, and more than one was in tears. 4 years from that time he was borne back to them dead, and all the way there the towns were hung with black, and each house strove to hang out the badge of grief for one who was mourned by all. There was talk of plots at that time to kill Lincoln on his way to Washington, but he went through safe. He was a man who would have been glad to have kept the peace of both North and South, but the South would not have it so. They thought a state had the right to go out if it chose to do so. This was states' rights, a creed that had long been held at the South, and there were 6 states who put it to vote and said they would go out of the Union. South Carolina was the one to lead the way. They said they would make a new band of states where it would be right to hold slaves, and they took Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The sound of the first gun at Fort Sumter was a shock to the whole land. Most of those at the North who had not felt the slave trade to be wrong now took sides with those who had been its foes from the first. All the states in the South took one side, but the slaves were of course for those who wished to make them free. Lincoln said in his speech at New York, when he was on his way to take his seat in the White House, "When the time comes for me to speak, I shall then take the ground that I think is right. Right for the North, for the South, for the East, and for the West, for all our land." And so he did. The war was a great grief to him. He said, "We did not think it would last so long. Both North and South read the same word of God, and both pray to him to aid them in a war on those bound to him by near ties. We hope, we pray that this scourge of war may soon pass from us." The states that went out of the Union sent men to meet and form a new band, and they chose Jefferson Davis as president. At this time some thought it would be best to let the states at the South go out, as all had a dread of war. Lincoln made a wise speech on the day he was made president. He said that he would do all that lay in him to keep the land one, but that he could not let the Union be torn in two by a part of it. He said the land could not stand but as one land, that they had to live face to face, the North with the South, and they must be friends. But he would not keep the South from their rights. Kind as his speech was, and wise as most men felt it to be, there were some who looked on it as a threat of war. The first fire at Sumter was like the tap of a drum, and all the South rushed to arms. At the North the news was like a live coal on the hearts of all. A rage swept in a day o'er all, such as had not been seen since the land was known. The slaves throughout all the South took it in their heads that the Yankees had come to set them free. They would help them in all ways. They served them as guides and were on hand to dig, work, or fight to get their rights. Lincoln said that his first great aim was to save the land and not to fight for the slaves. He wrote, "If I could save the Union, though I did not free a slave, I would do it. If I must let them all go free to save it, I would do it. Still in my own heart it is my wish that all men in all lands should be free." And at last it seemed best to him to send out a bill which should say that all held as slaves should from that date be free, and that they might serve in the ranks if they chose, or in ships, or at forts, or where there was a place, with all the rights of white men. Ere long a great mass of the black men took their place with Union troops and proved good and brave. There were at times men at the North who were full of fear lest the blacks should rise when they were free and do harm to those who had held them in bonds, but they did not. Lincoln heard that there were plots on foot to put an end to his life. He said with a smile, "If all this is true, I don't see what they would gain if they killed me. All would go on the same. When I first used to hear of these threats of death, I felt bad, but now they come so fast, I am used to them. There was a rhyme at this time which turned out to be true. The boys sang, "Now the war was begun in 61, and in 62 we'll put it through. In 63 the slaves will be free. In 64 the war will be o'er." At this time it looked as if the war had been put through. The first band of troops that went through Baltimore were fired on by the mob. They fired back, and 9 men fell. This made a great stir in the North. Lincoln did not find things in the North in a good state for war. The men came in the ranks on all sides when they heard the call. For arms were scarce, so they had to be bought or made in as short a time as they could. Clothes, too, had to be got for the troops, and food and carts to draw them all, and drags for the sick. It had all to be done in a short time, so that there should be no waste or want. Lincoln then made a law that no ships should go in or out of the ports of the South. The first great fight was at Bull Run, a stream in Virginia. Here the two great foes met. From the first things went wrong with the North, and at last they were put to flight and ran for their lives. The loss on their side was great. It was all in vain that the heads of the troops sought to bring them back to make a charge once more on the foe. They were full of fear and fled. On all the roads and paths that led to the place were crowds of men in full flight. Then came the great fight at Gettysburg, which seemed the point on which the fate of the land would turn. The North won, but it was at a great price. The South lost still more. It is said that Lincoln planned the great move that freed the Mississippi. He thought of it all the time, and his room was full of maps and plans. He would mark the points where the troops marched, and knew just where they were at all times. He soon saw that Grant was the man to be at the head of the troops, and he put him there. He showed that this was a wise move, for Vicksburg was soon in the hands of the Union troops. And at last the whole length of the Mississippi, from lands of snow to lands of bloom, was free, and the old flag waved o'er it. Lincoln showed at all times a kind heart, and those who went to beg the life of kith or kin knew that they could move him with their tears. One tells of him that in the first part of the war there was a young man who was to be shot, as he had slept at his post. His friends sought the president and begged for his life. Lincoln wrote that he should be set free. "I cannot go into the next world with the blood of that poor young man on my skirts," he said. "It is not strange that a boy raised on a farm, used to be in his bed at dark, should sleep on his watch, and I cannot have him shot for such an act." It is strange to know that the corpse of this youth was found with the slain on the field of Fredericksburg. He wore in his heart a card with the face of his loved president on it, and neath it in his hand these words, "God bless President Lincoln." Once, when one went to Lincoln to urge that a crowd of men who had sought to leave the troops should be put to death, he said, "For God's sake, don't ask me to make more wives weep in the United States." In all the war, it was Lincoln's way to think and act for his own self, and not leave it to someone else. He would hear what men said, but it did not have great weight with him. He had a talk with wise men on each case, but at the same time his own mind took the lead. In the South, things were in a sad state, but still they bore up with brave hearts. The crops failed and they could not get goods, save at a high price. At this time, Sherman's great march to the sea took place, and Savannah fell in his hands with all its guns and stores. The South was at its last gasp. One by one, the ports of the South had been lost to them. At Five Forks, the troops of the North with Sheridan had to fall back, but they made a charge and swept all in their way. Then Fort Gregg fell in the hands of the North. The troops of the South had no food and were in a sad state. There was no hope for them, and at last Lee sent word that he would come to terms. Grant met him and wrote out his terms. Lee took them. He did not have to give up his sword, and Grant let each man keep his horse, for he said they would need them all to plow the land when the spring came. Then the two chiefs shook hands, and Lee went his way. The brave President Lincoln was shot as he sat in his box at the play, by a man named Wilkes Booth. This man seemed to think that he would thus make up to the South for the woes of the war, as though Lincoln had been the cause of all. He had led a wild life. He laid this plan and had thought of it for some time. He had by some means got in the box and made the door fast, When he had shot Lincoln, he sprang from the box to the stage, but caught his foot and fell, and broke his leg. He had a horse at the door and got off, but was at last found in a barn, where he fought hard for his life. They set the barn on fire to drive him out, but he stood his ground and fought to the last, when he fell shot. Booth had shot Lincoln in the back of the head. The ball went in the back of the ear and lodged back of the left eye. He did not move much, but his head fell and his eyes closed. As the sound of the shot rang through the house, it was at first thought that it was part of the play. But a friend in the box saw at once what had been done, and caught at Booth, who at last got free. Lincoln could not speak. Those who stood by his bed saw there was no hope. All the land was full of gloom at the sad news. Men wept as they heard it. Each house wore a badge of grief as they bore his corpse back to his old home. The whole land seemed swathed and hung with black. To this day all hold his name dear. He had found his way to the hearts of all as no man had done. All knew that a brave, true man had passed from this earth. William H. Seward was born in Florida, Orange County, New York, May 10, 1801. He was the son of one whose work it was to cure the sick. When he was not much more than a boy in years, he taught school in Georgia. He took up law and soon rose to a high place at the bar, and led that side known as the Whigs. He was twice made the head of the state of New York, which he left at the end of his terms to take up law once more. A senator in 1849, he was made head of the state by Lincoln and Johnson. He did much good work for Lincoln and helped make him president. At the time Lincoln was shot, it was at first thought Seward would lose his life too, but he got off with but a few wounds made by one of Booth's friends. This man had forced his way into Seward's house as he lay ill. Seward was a man of mark and wrote a good deal for the press. He died at Auburn, New York, October 10, 1872. Salmon P. Chase was born in Cornish, New Hampshire, in 1808. At the age of 12, he was left to make his own way in the world and went to live with one of his kin, who taught the word of God and stood high in the church. While a young man, he taught school and took up law when he had a chance. At the bar, he soon rose to fame, and he tried his best to crush out the slave trade. It was through him that the Free Soil men made a move which placed Van Buren at the head of the land. When Lincoln was made president, Chase was placed in charge of the funds of the land. He was made chief judge in 1864 and tried President Johnson, but he thought he had done no wrong. He wrote some for the press of the day and had some skill in verse. He died in New York, May 7th, 1873. End of chapter 14.
Section 15 of the Lives of Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 15. Andrew Johnson, 1865 to 1869. The next day from that on which Lincoln met his sad fate, Andrew Johnson took the chair as the head of our land. Johnson was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, December 27, 1808. His folks were too poor to send him to school, so when he was but 10 years of age, he was sent to work for a man whose trade it was to make clothes. A friend of this man at times came into the shop and would read to the men at their work. This made Andrew wish that he might have books to read of his own, and he at once set to work to learn how to read, to write, and to spell. This was his task when his toil was done for the day, and he had gone to his poor bare room in the roof where he slept. But it was not till he was a man in years that he could read and write with ease. Then he was wed to a bright girl who taught him all she knew, and he showed an apt mind to learn. It was not long from this time ere He gave some thought to the laws of his land, and the way it was ruled, and he was soon placed at the head of his town. In a year or two from this time, he was sent to a high post from his state, and was then sent to Washington to help make the laws for 10 years. In 1853, he was made the head of the state of Tennessee. When the Great War broke out with the South and the North, he took sides with the North. When Lincoln was shot, he took the chair, which he held 4 years. He died near Elizabethtown, Tennessee, in 1875. General George B. McClellan, who had been one of the first chiefs of the Union Army, ran against Lincoln on the Democratic side in 1864, but did not win. End of chapter 15.
Section 16 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 16. Ulysses Simpson Grant, 1869 to 1877. Hiram Ulysses Grant, as he was named at birth, was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, April 27, 1822. We are told that when he was but 2 years of age, someone took him in his arms through the town, and that a young man who owned a gun wished to shoot it off and see what the child thought of the noise. So the babe's hand was laid on the lock of the gun and pressed there till it went off with a loud noise. The child did not cry out with fear at the sound, as they thought he would, and did not wink or dodge at the noise, though he had not seen such a thing as a gun in his life. So it is now told to show that at a young age he first gave signs that one day he would lead in war. As a boy, he was more fond of a horse than a dog, and when but 8 years of age, while left at home for the day, he hitched up their 3-year-old colt to a sled, and hauled sticks and brush from the woods near the house. When he was 10 years old, Mr. Grant, who saw that the boy knew how to drive, gave him a team in his charge, which he drove for 20 miles to the town and brought back a load. He soon learned to break a horse and to teach it to pace and trot. It was said by all those who lived nearby that no horse was too wild for that Grant boy to ride, for when he made up his mind to ride a horse, he rode. As a youth, He was known to have a strong hand and firm nerves. One day he drove some folks o'er a ford when the tide ran high and the waves rolled in on them. The boy was just as cool as if he stood on firm ground, though all the rest of those with him were filled with fear. Quote, "Don't speak, I will take you through safe," end quote, he said in a firm voice, and he did. At school he took the lead in all sports, for the boys saw at once that his was a mind born to rule. One strange thing in his life here was that he could not learn what can't meant, and we are quite sure that to this day he has not learned it. At school he was one of the few whom no one caught with an oath on his lips, for he thought that to swear was as bad as to take things that were not his own. While he did not go in for fights with the rest of the boys, or stir up strife in their midst, when they drove him to the wall he could take his part as well as the rest, and they soon learned to keep out of the way of his fists. He gave the strength of his arm to help the weak, and would let no one hurt a lame or sick boy at school if he could help it. While he did not lead his class at school, he learned his tasks well. When he was at an age to make a start in life, he did not choose a trade, but wished to learn more than was taught at the school where he had gone as a boy. His folks could not pay to send him to a first-rate high school, so they made up their minds to get him in at West Point if they could, where he might learn what he could free of charge. To this well-known school he went in 1839, and, though he did not go out of his way to make friends there, was soon the best-liked young man there. They all called him Uncle Sam, from the U.S. in the first part of his name. The way he came to be called Ulysses Simpson was when his name was sent in to West Point. The man who sent it in got the name mixed with that of someone else, but it clung to Grant through life, and he is known by it to this day. While at West Point, Grant made his way slow and sure up the rounds of school life. It was his great joy to read works on the arts of war and how men were trained for it, and it was not long ere he got the thought in his mind that he should like to bear arms some day for his own land. When he left school, Grant at once joined the list of our troops as lieutenant. Though we were at that time at peace with all the world, though there were some strife with the Indians in our states in the far west, it was young Grant's work while out there to give aid to those who lived in the woods and wild hills, and help them keep their homes from the firebrands of the redskins, and at times to drive them back in their haunts when they came out to rob and steal in the cold part of the year. The next year Grant was sent into Texas to drive out the Mexicans, and the first real fight that he was in was that which was fought at Palo Alto in 1846. We are told that he was brave and kept to the front of his men in the thick of the fight. From those first in rank he was much praised for the way he fought through all the war in Mexico, and it was not long ere he was raised to a high place in the troops. At the fight of Chapultepec, the most fierce that took place in the whole war, he was once more raised, and this time to the head of a small band of our troops. When the war at last came to an end, Grant went home north once more to New York. From there he went to the west to keep the Indians back in their raids. Here he still held good the name he had earned as a brave man who knew not fear. When the gold craze broke out in California, the thirst for gold brought vile, rough men there from all parts of the world who knew no love of God or man and lived wild lives. Young Grant and a force of men were sent out west to keep them within the bounds of our laws, if it could be done. For the good work he did while here, Grant was raised to the rank of captain. In 1854 he left the troops and went to live near St. Louis, and for 5 years was hard at work at a trade. At last he started to tan hides and skins in the town of Galena, Illinois, and did well from the first. The firm of Grant and Son were soon known as the best in the trade. When the war at last broke out and Sumter had been fired on, Grant at once left his work where he had done so well and took up arms. He formed the troops in his own state to march to the front and did a great deal to get men to join our ranks and to drill them for the great fights that were to come. He was soon made a colonel of these troops and at once trained them for the fight. He was made a general and placed in charge of a post at Cairo on the Ohio River. His first work was to block all the streams and roads for miles so that the South could not get food and guns through the lines. While in camp here, Grant is said to have lived a plain life and not at all like a man of his rank might have done. Those who were his aides wore more gold stripes and gewgaws than he. While their caps were gay with gold lace, he went through camp with an old black felt slouch hat on, with not so much as a gilt cord on it. He smoked all the time. In the month of October, 1861, Grant sent out men to stop the force from the south that marched on us. At Fredericktown the troops met, and Grant's men drove the foe back. They then came back to their old posts. The Confederates at this time held 2 forts, which Grant would have liked to get into his hands. They were Forts Henry and Donelson. As soon as Grant had a good chance, he set out with a small force of men and gunboats to take them. He had to go at night with great care down the stream to where the forts lay, for fear they should be blown up by things the foe had laid in their way. It was a bright day when Grant and his men came in front of Fort Henry, but the roads were bad as it had rained much in the night. The fort had but few troops left in it, as they had been sent to a fort a few miles off to give aid, but those that were there fought well and did their best to drive Grant and his gunboats off, but it was of no use. There was no chance that the fort could be held, so when they had fought hard inch by inch, they at last gave it up. A week from that day, Grant and his men left a charge on Fort Donelson, cheered by the thought that at least one of the forts they had set out to take was theirs. The fort on which they marched stood on a high bluff with a stream on one side of it. Grant knew it was a strong, well-built fort, and that he must get it if he hoped to break up the war, so he made up his mind to have his gunboats fire on it from the stream while he led his men to the walls by land. The first time he tried this, he failed. Then came a great snowstorm and rain that put them back in their work for a long time. All their food was gone, and there was no chance to get more for some time. They were in bad straits. Those who had wounds had naught to eat or drink, and their cries were sad to hear as they prayed for help or death. Not a few died from cold and lack of food. At last, when all hope was gone, our fleet came in sight on the 14th of February. Food was soon brought to the men, and the ships, in charge of Commodore Foote, turned to the fort and with no loss of time fired on it with all the strength of their guns. But the fort held its own. Sheets of flame and hail of fire burst from the loopholes in its walls, so that at last our gunboats had to draw back much hurt by the guns of the foe. The gunboats were in such a bad way that they had to be sent off to get fixed up. In the meantime, Grant held his place near the fort and cut off all chance of help from them. He knew it would not be long ere they would give up, for their food and drink could not last a long time. General Floyd, who led the men in the fort, thought he would try to cut his way out with his men through Grant's ranks, but he did wrong to count on this bold stroke, as it failed. But he and General Pillow made out to slip off one dark night to Nashville. The next morn, Grant made up his mind that he would waste no more time on a siege, but would storm the walls and drive them out. A flag of truce came just at this time, and he was asked on what terms he would let the chief of the fort give it up. Grant said at once that they must give up all, or he would at once move on their works. So they gave up the fort, and soon Grant's troops marched into its smoke-stained walls, while the stars and stripes waved in the breeze on the top of its flagstaff. The gunboats sent out shots to cheer our men as they marched to the sound of the drum and fife, while the crowds of men and folks on the bank sent out shout on shout of joy that the fight was won. But though Grant won the fight, it was at a high price. The field was red with blood, and from right to left the dead lay thick, and all the tents were full of maimed men. It was a sad sight. The fall of this fort broke the line of the forts of the South, and there was much fear through their ranks. At Nashville, the news was brought to the town while the folks were in church, and all grew pale as they heard it. It was true that the troops of the North were on their way south. In their fright and craze to get off, they gave large sums for a horse and cart to take them from the scene. They burned the grand bridge in the town that had been their pride, and some fine stores fell a prey to the flames. In a short time, stars and stripes waved o'er the city. While Grant was in this part of the state, he gave his men to know that they were in no case to rob and steal from those who had to live there, that they must have the folks think they came as friends and not as thieves. This rule they were forced to go by, and it was soon found to be a good and just one. At the fight at Shiloh there was a great loss on both sides, but at last the troops of the South were put to rout. Though shot and shell fell to left and right of Grant, he seemed to bear a charmed life, and did not get but one wound, and that by a sword on his foot. There was great joy in the North when the news of the fight reached them, and Grant was much praised for what he had done to win it. Grant was soon made next to the head of all the troops in the field, and the same year he laid siege to Vicksburg and Corinth. At Vicksburg the siege was long and fierce. A fleet of ships from the north kept up a fire on the town, while Grant and a force of men marched on it by land. His men had to live the meanwhile on what they could pick up, as there was no way they could get food from the north to them. It was not long ere Grant and his men held all the land and streams near the town, so that those in its walls could not get food and were in sore straits. Mule meat was sold in the streets, and folks were glad to buy it at a high price. When the shot and shell poured in on them, they sought caves in the hillside where they might hide from it. To add to this sad time, large parts of the town were blown up by the troops of the North, so that it was not safe there at all in the streets. In spite of all, the town was held for near 2 months, though it was strange how they could do it at all. Grant at last tired because they would not give in, and made up his mind for a great charge. General Pemberton, who was in charge of the troops in the town, tried to make terms with Grant, but he would not, and said he must go on with the work. The next day Pemberton had to yield, and the troops of the North were soon in the town. They did all they could to help the poor folks who had fought so hard for their homes, gave them food and clothes, and did all that could be done to bring them back to health and life once more. That day saw the stars and stripes wave from the Vicksburg courthouse. Grant took up his stand in Vicksburg, but he still kept hard at work.
Day and night his mind and thoughts were bent on what plans he might use to bring the war to an end. For he was sick of all the blood that had been spilled. The thought was sad to him that his men must take the lives of those who had been brought up neath the same skies as they, and in the same land. He would have peace at all price, but he knew that naught but war could bring it to pass. The news of Vicksburg's fall was heard with great joy in the North, for it now looked as if their cause would win, and that the South could not hold out for much time if things went on as they had done. They were proud, too, of Grant for the work he had done, for they knew he was the right man in the right place. It would not be out of place to say a few words here of life in camp with Grant. It has been said that he was hard on his men, and made them toil when they were not fit to bear arms, but this is not so. He was firm, but he was just, and saw to it that those in his charge had their rights. He made rules, and he saw that his men lived by them. If a man made up his mind to do right, he had naught to fear from Grant. It was those who were bad and who stole and drank that he was rough with. In his camp things moved like clockwork, as they should. There was no noise or broils in the tents, and to this care which he took to have things right, no doubt he owed much of his good luck in war. Those who lived near his camp had naught to fear from his men, as he kept them in bounds and would not let them raid the farms or burn and steal, as is oft done at such a time. To the poor slaves who had been set free he was just as kind as to the whites, and fed and cared for them in his camp when they had no place to lay their heads at night. In August 1863 Grant went to Memphis and got there late at night. The next day a grand feast was made for him, and speech and toast went round in praise of him, their guest, till it must have done his brave heart good. When Grant came back to Vicksburg, he had his troops march out that he might view them. This is said to have been his dress on that day, which shows that he was by no means vain, though he was great. He wore a plain suit with no sword, sash, or belt, his coat loose in front, a low-crowned soft felt hat on his head, and no mark on his dress of his rank, and a pair of kid gloves on his hands. That was what he wore. It was on this day that he viewed the troops that his horse fell on him, and he was much hurt, so much that for a time it was feared that he could not go into the field of war for some time. It made all in the North sad when this was known, but in a month's time, to the joy of his friends, Grant was once more on his horse at the head of his troops. In 1863, a fight took place at Chattanooga. Grant, for his work, got a gold badge from Congress. He was placed in charge of all our troops in the field in March of the next year. In the fight in the wilderness, he showed what a brave man could do. Here he met Lee. It was in the midst of dense woods through which he marched on the foe, where the trees grew so thick that his troops could not ride, so the fight went on in a hand-to-hand way. The shots and sparks from the guns soon set the woods on fire, which made it hard to breathe. In this hand-to-hand strife, men were at times so close to each that they could not fire their guns, but had to use them as clubs. Hancock had thrown up earthworks for his men to rest back of from the heat of the wood fire, but the wind set the brush in a flame by the sparks in the air, and soon drove the poor men out. This the Confederates thought was a good chance for them to seize on the works, so they made a rush and set their flag on the wall of the brushworks, but they did not hold their place long. A charge was made and they had to flee. In this fight, the Union troops met with great loss, and hosts of their men got bad wounds and dropped out of the fight. Lee soon found out that he must fall back if he did not want to leave all his men on the field, so he took up his ground at Spotsylvania Courthouse, where Grant found him and fought him for 3 days, though it could not be said that Grant or Lee won. It was a fierce fight, and no side could lay a just claim that they had won it. Grant's next work was to march to Petersburg with his troops and seize the place if he could, though this had been tried more than once. When he got in sight of the works of the foe at this place, he put it in a state of siege. As long as the town had food, they could hold out, and they did so for 10 months. In this time, Grant made 2 great moves to take the town. First, he dug a huge mine from a point in his lines to the fort of the foe. It was 4 feet wide and full of tons of stuff that could be lit by a fuse and blow things sky high. When this was all fixed, so it would go off, the fuse one day was lit. An hour went by and not a sound was heard from it. At last 2 brave men crept into the mine and found that the fuse was in 2 parts. They made it right so that it would fire the charge when lit and got out in haste, as the whole place blew up with a noise like the roar of a great sea. The fort was blown to bits, and in its place was a large chasm where lay heaps of dead and piles of guns. It was a sad scene. Then the Union troops charged on the fort or what was left of it, while their guns sent shots into the walls, but they were too late, for the foe were up in arms, and as the troops of the North filled the chasm where had late been the fort, they were mowed down like grass. And so the scheme of the mine did not turn out so well as they thought at first it might, and Grant lost a great host of men in the fight, so that he had to draw off his troops. But while he did not keep up the siege, he still kept hard on the heels of his foe, and the fight at a place known as Deep Bottom took place, where he won, and a great host of men fell in his hands. At 5 Forks the same year he won once more, and at last made up his mind that he would try for Petersburg once more. At 4 in the morn of April 3rd he charged on the forts at this place, and in a hard fight took 2 of them. He then had his men tear up all the railroads near the place, so that those in the town could not get food. General Lee, who had charge of the troops of the South in Richmond and Petersburg, saw at once that he and his men must leave, and on the 3rd of April the stars and stripes waved from the walls, and soon the boys in blue were seen in the streets of the towns that had been looked on as the strongholds of the South. It was a great day for the North when this news was known. It was not long from this time ere Grant drove Lee to the wall, and all the great hosts of troops led by that great chief of the South fell into his hands. This was one of the first signs that the South could not hold its own long, and soon in all the states of the South they gave up the fight. Grant's trip to the North, when peace had at last been fixed, was a grand one. At each place on the route there were crowds who wished to see the man of the hour who had done so much for them. He was made president in March 1869 by a large vote, and he held his seat for 2 terms. Horatio Seymour, who was governor of New York, was set up by the Democrats, but lost. In his time, all the states of the South came back to the Union. Great tracts of land were made ours, and the debt of the land was made much less. A law was made in his time which held that all men should have a right to cast their vote in this land, and no race or hue should be kept out. In Grant's last term, a grand show was held at Philadelphia to keep the day on which the states were made free. All the lands in the world sent things they had made to be shown there, and all the trades in the world had place in the great wars. When Grant's 2 terms were up, he took a tour around the world, and in all lands he was made as much of as though he had been a king. His last home was in New York. He fell sick in 1884, and after 8 months of pain he died at Mount McGregor, near Saratoga, on July 23rd, 1885, and was buried August 8th, 1885, at Riverside Park on the Hudson, New York City. Horace Greeley ran on the side that was not for Grant, and which was known at the time as the Liberals. It was made up of those men who wished for a change in the laws of the land. Greeley was a man of much note, who stood high in the minds of all in the land, and it was thought his name would sweep the States as by storm. Greeley came to New York in 1841 a poor boy, with small funds to start in life. His first work was to print a news sheet that was known by the name of the Log Cabin. The main view of this sheet was to aid General Harrison to the place of president. When this had been done, Greeley was the one to start the New York Tribune, which grew to be the voice of the Republicans and is to this day. This sheet was one of the first to cry down the slave trade and did much good work to place Lincoln in the chair. Greeley was sent to Congress in 1848, and it was he who went bail for Jefferson Davis, which brought him the hate of some men on his own side. He lost in the race for the presidential chair, as he took Democratic votes, which his own side thought was wrong, and it was this fact more than all else that lost him the day. The Tribune lost caste for a while at this time, and Greeley's mind soon grew weak when he knew his cause was dead. In a short time his health broke down, and he was put in a madhouse, where in a short time he died. End of section 16.
Section 17 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 17. Rutherford B. Hayes, 1877 to 1881. Rutherford B. Hayes was born in Delaware, Ohio, in 1822. He came of a brave race of men who had fought and bled in the wars of our land, and he was first taught to read and write at the state school near his home. He worked hard to learn his tasks and was let into the high school class, where he soon stood at the head. He next took up law and soon rose to a high grade as one of the bar. In the War of North and South, he did much for the cause of the North, and was looked on as a brave man, and one well placed to lead troops in a fight. While still in the field, his state chose him to send to Congress, and then he was put at the head of it for 3 terms. When he was at last made president, it was thought a fraud in the count by some, and most of the Democrats held that their man, Tilden, who had been governor of New York State, had won the day. Hayes found that the South was in a sad state, and he did much to bring peace to that land. He thought that if hard coin was brought in use once more in the place of bank bills, it would be a great help to all. In 1877 came what is known as the Great Railroad Strike. The heads of the great lines from the sea to the west said they could not pay as much as they had done, so all the men in their hire left their posts and came in mobs to stop the trains on their way. They thought they were not paid well for all the work they did, so they rose in arms to force those who hired them to come to terms. Troops were sent out to put a stop to this, and 9 of the men who struck were killed, and not a few got bad gun wounds. But the strike spread, and at one time it was feared the whole land might get into their hands. For 2 days Pittsburgh was held, to the great fear of those who lived there. Cars were burned on the tracks, and much grain spoiled that was stored in them. The troops, at length, with hard fights, got the whip hand of the mob, but did not till much had been burned and spoiled. In the spring of this year, a war broke out with an Indian tribe, known as the Nez Perces, who robbed and burned some towns, and slew the folks who lived there. General Howard was sent out to put a stop to this, but it was hard work at first to catch the redskins, for when our troops came near, they fled at once to the wild hills where they were at home. At last he got to their stronghold when he had chased them for a long time. A fierce fight took place, and they were soon put to rout. One of their chiefs got off with a few of his braves, but all the rest were slain or brought bound from the field of war. Samuel J. Tilden, who had been a very good head of the great state of New York, was the choice of the Democrats against Hayes. There was a great cry of fraud as to the way the count was made, and there were folks who thought a war might come of it. Tilden had the most votes in the whole country, but Hayes was placed in the chair, and all went well. Hayes is still living at Massillon, Ohio. End of section 17. Read by Carrie Adams, your book voice, at Mesa, Arizona, on the 10th of August, 2022.
Section 18 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 28, James Abram Garfield. Chapter 28, James Abram Garfield, March 4th, 1881 to September 19th, 1881. James Abram Garfield, whose sad fate made all the known world mourn his loss, was born in Orange, Ohio in 1831. His eyes first saw the light in a poor log hut, the cracks of which were filled up with mud to keep out the cold and rain, and the floor of which was made of hard clay. Here he spent his youth. He had books, and when he was through his hard day's work, he would climb up to a hole neath the roof of the hut, which was known as the loft, and sleep the sleep of the just on a pile of poor straw. He was the son of Abram Garfield, a poor but good man who died when James was but a few years old. The place where they lived lay in the midst of a deep wood, and the trees at times would take fire from the sparks thrown out by steam cars on the railroads some miles off. These fires would burn up much grain and stock on the farm, which his folks, who were quite poor, could not well bear to lose. Garfield made up his mind that the next time a fire came that way, he would try and see if he could not put it out ere it could waste the farm and lands that lay ripe with corn and grain. He had not long to wait. One night he saw a bright light shine through the chinks in the roof and sheets of flame near the house. He rushed out of the house and threw up banks of earth in the way of the fire, so that it could not scorch the fields of young corn that lay on each hand. Long hours he worked on, and at last saved his farm. but he died from the work, as he took a bad cold. So James was left to make his own way in the world, and worked on the farm when but a small boy. He milked the cows, sawed wood, and did all the chores there was need of on a farm. In the wilds where he was brought up, there was not much chance for him to go to school, as the roads were all new and were much like bogs in the time of rain and snow. The schoolhouse lay miles off and hard to reach, for the woods were filled with wolves and fierce beasts that were much feared by those who lived there. But in spite of all this, he went to school when he got a chance, and showed from the first that he was quick and apt to learn. At home in the cold nights of the year, when no one dared go out, by the bright fire as his light, he read much in the few books that were at hand, or that someone would lend him. He did not waste the hours of his life in play, as most boys of his age would do, and when but 8 years of age he could read and spell and knew much of the good book, as well as the tales and lore of his own land and those in far-off climes. And all this time that he stored his mind with great thoughts of great men, he did not cease to work, as a good son should, and hard work it was. He rose with the sun, we might say, and plowed or sowed from the time he rose from his bed till eve. He did not like to say, "I can't," when asked to do a thing, but said at all times, "I can do that." He had been taught, and he knew the words were true, that half the fight was to think you could do a thing. He had a firm trust and faith in God. God helps folks to be good, and if we do not have his help, we cannot hope to be good in aught. This his mother had told him. Yet James was a big boy ere he had heard a church bell toll, and when they did go to church, it was apt to be 8 or 10 miles off through the rough roads in the woods. The day of rest was oft passed by his folks in their home, much as they loved to hear the word of God. So were the first years of James Garfield's life passed, years in which he picked up a great deal from what he read and saw. Time rolled on, and he felt that he ought to go out into the great world and see it. What he had read in his books did but add to this wish. So he took a job to chop wood on the shores of Lake Erie. The sight of the ships on the lake made him wish that he might go to sea, for he had his own queer views, such as most boys share, that a life on the wave must be a gay one. He thought he would at least try a trip on the lake to see if he liked it. So he set out with his pick on his back to the dock where the ships lay moored. He found a man in charge on board of one, but he was not at all like those he had read of in his books. He was a coarse man who swore at him and bade him get off the ship or he'd throw him off. So sick at heart, the poor boy turned and left and took a place on a coal barge. With what he made here, James went back to his old home in the wild woods, glad to see once more the faces he loved. From that time, James Garfield went on and up to the goal of his hopes. He worked hard that he might go to school, and rose to be the head of his class in each branch. He was made one of the Ohio Senate and of Congress, and when the war of North and South broke out, he joined the troops of the North and fought as a brave man should. He soon took charge of the troops in parts of the land and won much fame in the great fights of the war. In 1880, he was named by the Republicans for president and was placed in the chair as the choice of the land. The Democrats wished to have General Hancock, a man who had fought well through the war, but he failed to win. 4 months from the time Garfield took this place, he was shot on July 2nd, 1881, by Charles Guiteau, while on his way to take a train for the North. They bore him back to the White House, where he lay for a long time on a bed of pain, while all hearts were sad for him, and all prayed to God that his life would be spared. When he got worse, they took him to Long Branch, in the hope that the sea air would do him good. In a house on the beach he lay ill for a space of 3 weeks, but he did not get well, and on September 19, 1881, he drew his last breath. When this was known, the old world and the new wept as one land o'er his new-made grave. The hearts of kings and queens of far-off lands went out in grief to those he left to mourn round his own fireside. And in our own land the grief was most felt. For weeks the loss of this great and good man was mourned by all. Guiteau, who had done the deed, was hung for his crime. Garfield's name stands bright as the stars in the sky of night on the scroll of fame, writ in fire that burns on through all the years. End of section 18. Read by Jacqueline Tyler, Owasso, Oklahoma, September 3rd, 2022.
Section 19 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 19. Chester Allan Arthur, 1880 to 1884. Chester A. Arthur was born in Fairfield, Franklin County, Vermont, in 1830. He went to the state schools near his home for some years, for it was the wish of his folks that he should learn all he could. Arthur was but a lad when he went to Union College to learn. He did so well while there that in 1849 he had gone through each course they had in the school. The whole time he was at this place, he paid his way by his own work. He taught school, and in this way got quite a small sum, which he laid up in the bank for his time of need. When he was through school, he still taught, and at one time was at the head of quite a large school in Vermont. As he had by this time some means laid by, he set out for New York, for he wished to take up law. He stayed here till he was let into the bar, and then made a start of his own with an old friend and schoolmate. They thought they would try the West first, but soon made up their minds to come back to New York, where they soon won a name in the state. In 1856, Chester Arthur won a suit which gave the blacks the right to ride in horse cars with the whites. A slave girl had been put out of a streetcar in New York, and Arthur sued the firm who owned the line and won his case with a small sum for the girl. For some years from this time, General Arthur held high place in the state of New York and did such work that he was liked by all. He was twice made the chief in charge of the port of New York. In 1880, he was made vice president of our land. When President Garfield died at Long Branch, he was at once sent for to come there, and at 2 on the morn of September 30, he was sworn in as our president at his home in New York. In 1883, the great Star Route case came up. The cause of it was said that a ring of men had made use of that part of our mails, which they had in their charge, to cheat the government. On the 14th of June, 1884, the case came to a close, and they were let off. In 1884, 2 great fairs to show the arts and trades of the states were held in Louisville and New Orleans, which drew folks from all parts of the land. General Arthur went back to his home and his law office in New York City at the end of his term. It was thought that General Arthur would have been put up again, but James G. Blaine of Maine, a smart and well-read man who had held high place in the laws of the land for more than a score of years, was the choice of the Republicans. There was a split in the party, and he lost the day, and the Democrats got their man Grover Cleveland in. End of section 19. Section 20. of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 20. Grover Cleveland, 1885 to 1889. Stephen Grover Cleveland was the first Democrat who had the chair for more than a score of years. He was born in the town of Caldwell, New Jersey, on March 18, 1837, and was the fifth child of a good man whose task it was to preach the word of God in the church of the place. He came of a good stock, and one that might fill him with pride of birth, not for their wealth, but for their gift of mind. He was of a race that had shown a strong will and brave hearts. When he was but 3 years old, they moved to Fayetteville, New York, and this was where he spent 9 years of his life and went to school most of the time. They were poor, but the boys and girls had all the chance they could wish to go to school, so that they might be fit to hold posts of trust when they grew up and were of an age to earn their bread. When Parson Cleveland grew sick, Grover at once made up his mind that he would like to earn his own bread and help his folks. His first place was in a store in this town, where he was paid a small sum for his work, and we are told that he was true to his trusts and gained the goodwill of all in the place. This he held for 2 years, when he went back to his books. But a great grief was in store for Grover that he did not think would come so soon. Parson Cleveland, worn out with his work, died. This death made a change in the whole course of Grover's life. He had to go back to work and earn bread for those who were in need at home. He found a place in the Home for the Blind in New York, where he stayed for 2 years. At the end of that time, he made up his mind that he would learn law. So he set out with a friend to the west part of the state, where they hoped they could get a chance. 'Twas a strange quest on which these 2 youths thus set out. They had no friends to find them a place, and their funds were small to keep them while on the search. He stopped in Buffalo with one of his kin, who found him at last a place such as he wished. It was said of him that at this time that when he had work to do, he did it, and did it well. He was at work in this place for 8 years, and the first year he was not paid at all for what he did. When the war broke out, Grover had a wish to go and bear arms for the help of his land, but he thought it was not right when those at home were in need of help and had no one else to look to for it. But there were 2 that went forth from that home to do or die for the right. Cleveland soon was known as a man well versed in the law, and he took charge of more than one great case that brought him in much fame. For the most part of the time he was on the side that won. He was soon called to take more than one high place to put in force the laws of his state. He is said to have worked at all times for the cause of a poor man with more zeal than for the rich, if he thought he was in the right. His fame soon spread through the state, and he was placed at the head of the town, and then at the head of the state. He was at all times hard at work, and would oft spend the whole night with his books when he had to read up for a case. At no time in his life did he seek for place. It was his own true worth that won them for him. He made his way up step by step, and soon won the goodwill of all. As the chief man in the laws of Buffalo, he showed his true worth in the way he put down those who had lived by bribes in high places, and he did much to cleanse the town of such men as stood in the way of its best growth. When the time came to choose a head for the great state of New York in 1882, Cleveland was named to stand for the place. Charles Folger ran with him, but lost by great odds. In his place as the head of the state, Cleveland showed that he was worthy the trust that men had placed in him, and he still went on with his good work. The term of Cleveland's stay in the White House was not marked with great changes or much of note. What was called the Chinese Bill was passed to keep out the Chinese from this land. Some felt that this was not a just bill, as the same rule was not made for those who came from the rest of the world. Men thought it was not fair to pick out China and say that no man who came from there could land on our shores. But those who wished the bill to pass said that the Chinese did not want to be Americans and would not be if they stayed here for years. They came here to make what they could, but they meant to go back to their homes at last and take with them all they had made. They would not take the right to vote if they could get it. So the bill was passed to keep them out, but the Chinese who were here at the time had leave to stay. The Mills Bill to make the tax less on all goods brought into the United States made more stir than aught else in Cleveland's term. The cry of free trade rose, and the classes who work, the men of trade, took fright. They knew the price of all work was low in Europe, and they thought if a tax were not fixed on the things made there, they would sell just as cheap here, or else American things would have no sale at all. Then they said wages here would soon be as low as in Europe, and the poor man would have less to live on. When Cleveland was put up for a new term, the cry of "No free trade" rang through the land, and the fear of that change did much to make him lose votes. But all he wished to do was to make the tax less. This tax on goods and all things brought into our ports is called a tariff. Cleveland was the first president who was wed in the White House. He took for his wife Miss Frances Folsom. James G. Blaine of Maine had a host of friends who would have been glad to have made him the next president. He was in Europe when the choice was made, and it is said he would have served if he had been the choice of all. But there were some who feared to put him up, as he had not proved the best man to win the last time. So they chose Benjamin Harrison of Indiana, and he gained the place. He was made our president on March 4, 1889. End of section 20.
Section 21 of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Cornell Urich. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 21. Benjamin Harrison, 1889 to 1893. Benjamin Harrison, our president at this time, was born at North Bend, Ohio, and is the son of John Scott Harrison and the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the 9th president of the United States. He learned law and was wed when quite young to Miss Lavinia Scott. When the war broke out, he helped raise men to form what was called the 70th Indiana, and he was made colonel for it. For 2 years, he served well in the fight with the foe. For his brave work at Resaca on May 14, 1864, he was made a brigadier general. He stayed on till the close of the war. He was liked by his men, for he was kind to them, and they called him Little Ben. He went back to his home and his work at law when the war came to an end. His state chose him to a place in the Senate. While there, he showed in his speeches that he was not for free trade. And now, 10 times 10 years had passed since George Washington had been called to take his place as first president of our land. It was thought fit to keep the day to mark the great changes that had been made in this time, and to think of the good and great men who had helped the land in its sore need, who had led in the war that made us free, and ruled in such a wise way when peace came at last. So what was called the Washington Centennial was held in New York City on April 29 and 30, 1889. Stores and houses were decked with flags, and arches were built of wood and wreathed, and hung with red, white, and blue. The well-known face of Washington looked out on all sides from wreaths of green. The streets were filled by a dense mass, and rank on rank of troops filled by for hours. The drums beat, the bands played their best, and cheers rang on all sides, as that long train of men marched on. The President and all his men were met by a barge and brought to the slip at Wall Street with all the ships of war drawn up each side. As they went up the steps of the City Hall, young school girls in white strewed flowers in their way, as the girls had done in the time of Washington. In the churches, men met to give thanks, and then the President and his friends went to the same place where Washington took his oath to serve as President. Speeches were made there. Harrison spoke for a short time in a strong voice, and he was greeted with cheers. The troops from the South, with the flags of their states, were all there, side by side, with Union men, so that it seemed that they thought of the war no more. So grand a sight as these long lines of troops have not been seen in the United States since the men came back at the close of the war and marched through Washington. At the night, fireworks were sent off at points through the town. The German, the French, the Swiss marched side by side, some in quaint garb such as they had worn in their homes in the old lands. The Germans sent large floats, built at a great cost. They showed the way in which some of the trades were worked. The boys from the free schools made a fine part of the show. The first thing that was done while Harrison was president was to pass the tariff bill brought into the House by Mr. McKinley. By this bill, the tax on all goods brought into the United States was fixed so as to keep out cheap goods from Europe and thus make sure of high wages to the American working man. A Congress for all the American states was held at Washington, and men from Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and other Spanish states met to talk over a plan for a great union of all America, and thus make them better friends with us and with each other. Away up in the north of the Pacific Ocean is the home of the pretty seals from which we get the furs that are made into coats and capes and caps. The place where the young seals are born is called Alaska, and the trade is one of great value to our people. Now many ships from other nations used to go and kill these harmless animals, and the President thought that this must be put a stop to. He made an agreement at last with the British and others to prevent this killing of the seals in the sea. This agreement is called the Bering Sea Treaty. Another bill was passed in Congress to pay the soldiers of the North who had been hurt in the late war between the North and the South more money as long as they lived. This is the pension bill. 2 new states were let into the Union. They were the large states in the Northwest called Idaho and Wyoming. In 1890, the people of the United States were counted, and it was found that there were about 63 millions of souls in the country. In 1880, there were only 50 millions, and in 1870, 39 millions. At this time, the center of population is near Greensburg in southern Indiana. Several laws were passed in Congress to check the great immigration from foreign countries. This step was taken because many of the newcomers were not likely to be good citizens, and because the free land, which the government used to give to settlers, has all been taken up. In 1891, a new party was formed. It is called the People's Party. It asks for the free coinage of silver, the election of the president by the people, and the change in the tariff from protective duties to taxes for revenue only. During the year 1891, we lost by death Admiral Porter, our naval hero, and General W.T. Sherman, who was so famous during the Civil War by his March to the Sea. President Harrison, when his term of office was ended, went back to his home in Indiana and resumed his practice of the law. In 1892, 400 years had passed since Christopher Columbus first saw America, and the great show of all that the art, wealth, or work of the world could display was held in the city of Chicago. The president went there and on October 14 opened the World's Fair with a speech, but it was not really open to the public till next year. End of section 21.
Section 22 of Lives of the President of the United States in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kylan Weber of BridgeRecording.com. Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson. Chapter 22, Grover Cleveland, 1893 to 1897. Grover Cleveland, who had been president before Harrison, was again made president. The cry of free trade rang through the land, and he said that he would try to make the tax on goods brought in from abroad less than it had been in the McKinley Bill. In May, the doors of the World Fair at Chicago were opened. It was the largest and most beautiful fair that ever was held. It was in a park by the side of Lake Michigan, and the ground was laid out with great taste. There were great pieces of water, and many islands and bridges and boats of all kinds, from little steamboats to the strange-looking gondolas that came all the way from Italy, sailed about on the waters. There were miles and miles of most beautiful buildings, all of white and filled with all sorts of rich and rare things from all parts of the globe. There were pictures and statues without end, and all kinds of machines and gold-silver work, and silks from the Far East, and great pieces of needlework, and all kinds of corn and wheat and breadstuffs, and everything that people eat, and everything that people wear, and all kinds of wood from our trees, and gold, and coal, and iron, and silver from our mines, and glassware, and all sorts of toys and dolls that strange little children, white and black, beyond the seas like to play with. At night the whole place was lighted up by thousands of lamps and various colors that shone on the tall jets of water that sprang up into the air from the little lakes in the fairgrounds, while bands of music played everywhere. Almost all the states in the Union had each a building of its own, in which it showed what crops each of them grew, and what were the things that each of them made in their workshops. Just outside the fair there had been built German houses from a village from Java, and shops kept by Turks and Greeks, and a whole street from the Egyptian town of Cairo, with a lot of humpbacked, long-necked, and long-legged camels on which you could ride about just as folks do in the East. The best thing was the sight of the tame lions that rode on horses and jumped over ropes and did whatever their masters bid them, and played with each other just like so many pussycats. It will be long before we see such a World Fair again. In Congress, a tariff bill was brought in to make tax on many things lower than it had been. Some people call it a free trade bill and do not like it at all, as they say it will make wages lower. Others like it, as they think it will let us buy at a cheap rate many things which we all use or need. Just before it was brought into the House, there was what is called a panic, and prices of all things fell very low. Many workshops were shut up, and scores of workmen were thrown out of work. So there was a great distress in all parts of the country. Many of the party that had made Cleveland president turned against him now, and when he sent into the Senate some names of men whom he wished to be made judges, the Senate would not have them made. At last he named Mr. White of Louisiana judge of the Supreme Court, and him the Senate gave its vote for. For out in the Pacific Ocean are the Sandwich Islands. They had a queen which some of her people did not like, so they put her off her throne and asked the United States to take the islands into the Union. A great many people wish this to be done, as they are rich and grow a deal of sugar. But the President has not done so yet, as he thinks we ought to leave other countries to themselves till it is quite sure that they want to join us. After the late war, we did not build any new ships of war for many years, but for the last 10 years a fleet of fine new ships has been built. Line of battleships, cruisers, and torpedo boats. They have iron plates on their sides to keep them safe, large guns that can throw balls for miles, and brave crews, and they can sail faster than other ships. Our fleet is still small, but it is good. In the long years that have passed since the time of our first president, George Washington, there have been great changes. The small band has grown into a great throng. The town is now a great mart, and ships with their white wings sail into the great bay, and night like birds to a strand. The God of Washington, from whose hand the years fall like grains of sand, has blessed the land with wealth. All men are free from north to south. And as our thoughts go back to those who fought and bled for us in the past, we thank God for their faith and for all they have won for us. May we mark well the path they trod and stand up like them for truth and God. May peace still crown our land while our flag flings out its stars and stripes o'er north and south as one. End of section 22. End of Lives of the Presidents of the United States in Words of One Syllable by Helen W. Pierson.